tanner. Ever wondered who had the worst-smelling job in the ancient world? Forget the pharaohs, priests, and pyramid builders. The title probably goes to the humble tanner. This was the person who turned animal hides into leather, and the process was about as far from glamorous as you can imagine. If you were a tanner in ancient Egypt, you didn't just stink, you practically lived inside a permanent cloud of rotting flesh. Here's what a day in their life looked like. First, they had to collect animal skins from butchers. These weren't fresh, clean hides. They were often covered in blood, fat, and bits of meat. The first step was scraping all that off by hand, using primitive knives. Picture standing under the Egyptian sun, surrounded by piles of animal parts, while flies swarmed around your head. That was just the warm-up. Then came the real magic, and by magic I mean stomach-turning horror. To soften the hides and remove hair, tanners used a mix of water, animal dung, and yes, human urine. The ammonia in urine helped break down the fibers, but it also meant the smell was so bad it could cling to a person for days. Ancient tanners were sometimes forced to live outside city walls because no one could stand to be near them. Once the hides were soaked and scraped, they had to be stretched and pounded to make them pliable. This wasn't a quick process. It took days, even weeks of constant labor. The work was physically brutal. You were on your feet all day, hauling heavy, wet hides, breathing in chemical fumes that irritated your lungs, and risking nasty infections from cuts and open sores. Any tiny cut could lead to serious illness because they were basically marinating in a bacterial soup. And let's talk about status. Tanners were seen as dirty, low-class workers. They were essential to society. Leather was needed for sandals, shields, chariot harnesses, and more, but no one wanted to associate with them. They were the invisible backbone of civilization, producing something everyone used, but no one respected. What's wild is how universal this job was. Every ancient civilization had tanners, from Egypt to Mesopotamia to Rome, and it was always considered one of the filthiest jobs. Some cultures even banned tanners from certain religious ceremonies because they were considered unclean. And honestly, after standing next to vats of urine all day, who could argue? So the next time you slip on a leather jacket or sit on a leather chair, think about the poor souls in ancient Egypt who had to wrestle with piles of dead animal skin, stir cauldrons of pee, and come home smelling like something the Nile coughed up. They suffered so your ancestors could have sandals, and that's a job that deserves a little respect, even if it still makes your nose curl just thinking about it.
Fuller. Think your laundry chores are bad? Try washing clothes in buckets of pee for a living. That was the reality for the Roman fuller, a worker whose entire job revolved around cleaning and whitening clothes, with fermented urine as their secret ingredient. And yes, it was every bit as nasty as it sounds. So how did this bizarre job come about? In ancient Rome, people wore tunics made from wool, which doesn't exactly stay fresh on its own. Sweat, dirt, grease, and all the grime of city life would cling to the fabric. Soap, as we know it, wasn't an option yet. Instead, Romans discovered that the ammonia in urine was fantastic for breaking down grease and brightening fabric. Enter the fullers, the unlucky folks tasked with turning this foul-smelling science into daily work. The process started with collection. Urine was actually taxed in Rome because it was so important for the laundry industry. People were encouraged to relieve themselves in public pots, which were then collected by the fullers. Imagine hauling around jars of warm urine through crowded Roman streets, and that's before the washing even began. Once the fullers had enough, they poured it into huge vats and tossed in dirty clothes. And here comes the real horror. Workers didn't just stir the mix with sticks, they climbed into the vats themselves. That's right, they stomped on clothes with their bare feet, kneading and pressing the fabric like bakers working dough. Except instead of flour, it was sour, fermented pea. This stomping could go on for hours, leaving their skin raw and their lungs full of ammonia fumes. And it wasn't just about cleaning. After urine soaking, clothes were rinsed, brushed, and sometimes treated with clay or chalk to make them look brighter. Fullers worked tirelessly to make sure tunics came out spotless, which made them essential members of Roman society. But essential doesn't always mean respected. Just like tanners, fullers carried the permanent stink of their trade. They were considered low class, dirty, and unworthy of higher social standing. The health risks were no joke either. Constant exposure to ammonia damaged their skin, eyes, and lungs. Standing for hours in urine-soaked water often caused open sores, which could easily get infected. And since protective gear wasn't a thing, every fuller carried their work on their body, literally. Still, the industry thrived. Roman emperors themselves benefited from fullers' work, since even the rich wanted spotless, bright tunics. The irony is almost funny. The same elite who turned up their noses at fullers were proudly walking around in pea-washed clothes every day. So the next time you complain about folding laundry or running the washing machine, remember this. There were once people whose entire existence was spent stomping in tubs of other people's waste, just so Rome could stay fashionable. They may not have been glamorous, but without the fullers, the empire streets would have been filled with citizens wearing stained, stinking tunics. Now that's a job you wouldn't want to take home with you.
Whipping boy. Ever get in trouble at school and wish someone else could take the punishment for you? Believe it or not, in medieval and Renaissance Europe, that was a real job, and it was called being a whipping boy. The catch? You were the one getting whipped, and the person who messed up was usually a prince. Here's how this bizarre setup worked. Princes were considered too important to be physically punished. No one could lay a hand on the future king. That would be an insult to the crown itself. But royal children were still kids, and kids definitely misbehave. So someone had to take the punishment when they skipped lessons, swore at their tutor, or refused to study. The solution? Assign them a personal friend, usually another boy from a noble but lower-ranking family who would be raised alongside them and get beaten on their behalf. The job started young. These boys were chosen to be close companions to the prince, almost like playmates. They ate together, learned together, played together, and that bond was actually the whole point. When the tutor or king's court punished the whipping boy, the idea was that the prince would feel so bad seeing his friend get hurt that he'd behave better next time. Basically, they weaponized friendship as a form of discipline. But let's be clear, this was no light slap on the wrist. Punishments could include being caned, lashed with a switch, or even flogged until the boy cried out. And you didn't get to say, "Hey, wait, I didn't even do anything." Your entire job was to suffer so the future monarch wouldn't have to. Being a whipping boy was complicated. On one hand, it was technically an honor. You got to grow up in the royal household, got an elite education, and had access to the future ruler of the country. Some whipping boys became lifelong friends and powerful advisors once the prince grew up. But on the other hand, you spent your childhood as a human punching bag. Imagine waking up every morning wondering if today's beating would be your fault or not. Imagine having no control over whether you'd end up with bruises because your royal buddy decided to throw a tantrum. And if the prince was cruel, he might deliberately misbehave just to watch you suffer. The whipping boy tradition eventually faded as views on education and punishment changed, but it left behind one of the strangest historical phrases we still use today. Calling someone a whipping boy now means they take the blame for someone else's mistakes, and most people don't even know it comes from a literal job description. So next time someone complains about being the scapegoat at work, you can remind them at least no one is dragging them to the courtyard and actually whipping them for their boss's bad decisions. Being a whipping boy was the ultimate case of don't shoot the messenger, except the messenger always got hit anyway.
Groom of the stool. If you think your job is degrading, wait until you hear about this one. In Tudor England, there was an actual royal position called the groom of the stool. And yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. This person's job was to help the king go to the bathroom. Let's break this down. In the 1500s, privacy wasn't quite what it is today. The king's life was public, regimented, and carefully managed, including his bodily functions. The stool, in Groom of the Stool, referred to a portable toilet, basically a fancy wooden chair with a hole and a chamber pot underneath. Whenever the king felt nature calling, it was the groom's job to set everything up, assist him as needed, and, this is the part that makes people squirm, help him clean up afterward. Now, before you laugh too hard, this was actually considered a very prestigious job. The groom of the stool was usually a high-ranking nobleman, not a servant off the street. In fact, this position was one of the most powerful roles in the royal household because the groom had constant private access to the king. When you're the guy who sees the monarch at his most vulnerable moments, you become a trusted confidant. But make no mistake, the work itself was intimate. The groom had to ensure clean linens, fresh water, and keep everything spotless and ready for use. He also kept records of the king's bowel movements. Yes, there were actual logs about the king's logs, because in those days, tracking digestion was considered important medical information. It wasn't all gross, though. Being this close to the king meant you could whisper advice,
influence decisions and earn enormous political favor. Some grooms of the stool became incredibly wealthy and powerful just by being in the right place at the right time. So, in a weird way, wiping the king's behind could be a shortcut to climbing the social ladder. Still, let's be honest, this was not a job for the faint of heart. You had to maintain total composure no matter what the royal digestive system threw your way. There were no sick days from this role. If the king needed you, you were there, day or night. And unlike other servants, you couldn't exactly refuse your duties without losing your position and possibly your head. This job lasted well into the reign of Henry VIII and beyond, until changing attitudes about privacy and personal hygiene eventually made it obsolete. By the time of later monarchs, the groom of the stool became more of a financial officer, which must have been a huge relief, literally and figuratively. So yes, there once was a man whose career was built on royal bathroom breaks. It sounds absurd, but it shows how power and intimacy often went hand in royal courts. The groom of the stool may have been wiping bottoms, but he was also pulling strings behind the scenes.
Executioner's apprentice. The crowd holds its breath. The axe falls, and the condemned man is still alive. His neck is split, but not severed, and the gasps turn to horrified shouts. This is when the executioner's apprentice steps forward, hands shaking, and does the one thing no one ever wants to do: finish the job. Being an executioner's apprentice was the grimmest on-the-job training imaginable. You didn't just fetch tools and sweep up afterward. You learned how to take lives, and you were expected to do it right. An apprentice might start young, watching the master executioner prepare gallows, sharpen blades, and study the condemned. The goal wasn't just punishment, but efficiency. One clean stroke, quick and merciful. But mistakes happened, and when they did, it was often the apprentice who had to step in. Dull axes, bad angles, and panicked flinches could turn a beheading into a nightmare. The apprentice's job was to grab the axe or even a knife and keep hacking until the head came off. Sometimes it took 3, 4, even 5 blows. The condemned would be screaming, the crowd booing, and every second made things worse. No pressure, right? This was a public spectacle, too. Executions were entertainment, and the crowd demanded a clean show. If the apprentice botched it, they risked turning an execution into a scandal. Some apprentices were chased, beaten, or even killed by angry mobs after a botched execution. But there was no quitting. Apprentices didn't just assist with beheadings, they also helped with hangings, burnings, and drawing and quartering, basically every gruesome form of justice you can imagine. Afterward, they were the ones who disposed of the bodies, scrubbed the blood from the square, and prepared the tools for the next job. It was dirty, dangerous, and psychologically brutal work. And don't think this came with social perks. Executioners and their apprentices were considered necessary evils, too useful to shun completely, but too unclean to be fully accepted. They lived on the edge of society, often in special houses outside town. People avoided them in public, wouldn't sit next to them at meals, and sometimes wouldn't even make eye contact. The strange part? If you survived long enough, this job could actually make you influential. A skilled apprentice could rise to become the master executioner, which came with steady pay, housing, and a grim sort of respect. You were feared, yes, but you were also protected by the law. No one dared cross you, because you literally held the sword of justice. Still, it's hard to imagine a worse first day at work than being handed a dull axe and told to finish what your boss couldn't. If internships are supposed to teach you resilience, the executioner's apprentice learned it with every swing.
Plague Corpse Collector. The bell rings in the dead of night, and everyone bolts their doors. That sound means the collectors are coming. Men with carts who roam the streets shouting, "Bring out your dead!" If you were one of those collectors during the Black Death, you had one of the most terrifying and dangerous jobs in all of history. The plague hit Europe in the 14th century like a nightmare made real. Whole families died within days, and cities were overwhelmed. The job of the corpse collector was simple but horrific. Gather the dead and haul them away before the disease spread further. That meant going house to house, often stepping over still breathing victims and pulling out bodies by hand. Collectors worked through alleys where the stench was unbearable. They used long hooks or crude stretchers to drag corpses from homes. Sometimes the dead were piled outside, waiting. Other times the collectors had to search rooms where terrified survivors were hiding. In the worst moments, they didn't wait for death. Some accounts say collectors were accused of tossing out people who were barely alive just to keep the streets clean. Once the bodies were loaded onto a cart, the work wasn't over. Collectors had to take them to mass graves, huge pits dug outside the city walls, and dump them in. Some pits held hundreds, even thousands of corpses. The collectors would then cover them with lime or soil and head back into the city for more. And this wasn't a one-day task. During the height of the plague, they repeated this process over and over, day and night for weeks at a time. The risk was unimaginable. These men were constantly exposed to the plague. They had no protective suits, no gloves, no masks, just rags or cloaks they tied around their faces. Most collectors didn't survive long. Some were criminals or desperate poor men who took the job because it was the only way to earn money or avoid punishment. But their work was essential. Without them, entire cities would have been buried in their own dead. The psychological toll must have been immense. Imagine spending every day surrounded by nothing but death. Wailing families, bloated corpses, the smell of decay in every breath. Some collectors reportedly drank heavily just to numb themselves enough to keep working. And yet for all their service, they weren't celebrated. Many people feared them, seeing them as carriers of death. They were shunned, avoided, and sometimes attacked by angry mobs who blamed them for spreading the plague. So the next time someone calls their job soul-crushing, they might want to remember the plague corpse collectors, the men who faced death up close, night after night, so their cities wouldn't collapse under the weight of their dead. It was dirty, thankless, horrifying work, but without them, there might not have been anyone left to rebuild once the plague was over.
Sin Eater. A family gathers around a freshly dead relative. The room is silent except for the sound of a man chewing bread over the corpse. When he finishes, everyone exhales with relief because, according to local belief, he just ate the dead person's sins. Welcome to the grim, eerie job of the Sin Eater, a profession that existed for centuries in parts of rural Britain and Wales. The job was as strange as it sounds. A Sin Eater's role was to perform a ritual that supposedly transferred the sins of the deceased into himself, so the dead could enter the afterlife clean. Here is how it worked. When someone died, the family would call for the village Sin Eater. He was usually a poor outcast, living on the edges of society. They would place a piece of bread and sometimes a bowl of ale or beer on the chest of the corpse. The Sin Eater would come in, mutter a few ritual words, and eat and drink what was left. Symbolically, the food absorbed the dead person's sins, and when the Sin Eater consumed it, those sins passed to him. It was a deeply unsettling job. People believed the Sin Eater literally took on the spiritual burden of the dead, which meant by the end of his life, he was weighed down with the guilt of dozens or even hundreds of souls. The job was feared as much as it was needed. Villagers wanted their loved ones' sins gone, but no one wanted to be near the man who carried them all. Socially, Sin Eaters were treated like human trash bins for morality. They were barely spoken to, often shunned outside of their work. They lived alone, avoided in the streets, and were never invited to village events. They were useful, but they were also considered cursed, even dangerous to be around. And let's talk about what this must have felt like psychologically. Imagine walking into a room where a grieving family is staring at you, silently hoping you'll save their relative's soul for a few coins and a crust of bread. The pressure was enormous. Some Sin Eaters may not have even believed in the ritual, but they did it because they had no other way to survive. Even the food itself wasn't exactly appealing. It had been sitting on the dead body, sometimes for hours. The smell of the corpse, the grief in the room, the heavy silence, all of it made this meal an act of pure endurance. The practice eventually faded out by the 19th century as church doctrine and modern funeral practices took over. But the idea lingers in folklore, and the term Sin Eater has even found its way into literature and TV shows. So next time you think of strange jobs from history, remember the Sin Eater, the man who took on the spiritual garbage of an entire village, bite by bite, until he was the most feared and lonely person alive.
Leech collector. The water is cold and murky, but you have to keep moving. Your bare legs are already covered in wriggling black shapes, leeches, and that's the whole point. Welcome to the job of the leech collector. one of the most miserable and painful professions in history. During the 18th and 19th centuries, leeches were medical gold. Doctors believed bloodletting cured almost everything: fevers, infections, headaches, even mental illness. But they needed a constant supply of fresh leeches to keep up with demand. And someone had to collect them. That someone was usually a poor woman or child, because no one else would take the job. Here's how it worked. Collectors would wade into ponds, marshes, or swamps where leeches thrived. They often wore no protection on their legs because the fastest way to catch leeches was to let them bite. Once enough of the creatures latched on, the collector would pull them off by hand and drop them into a container. Then they'd go back in for more. It was exhausting and dangerous work. Leeches can drink several times their body weight in blood, so after a few hours in the water, collectors would be dizzy and weak from blood loss. The wounds often bled long after the leeches were removed, leading to infection, scarring, and in some cases, death from disease. And then there was the psychological factor. Imagine standing still while dozens of slimy worms attach themselves to your flesh, wriggling and sucking away. Some collectors reportedly developed fevers and fainted right in the swamp. Others became so anemic from repeated bites that they were too weak to work, which was a cruel irony, since this was usually the only job they could get. Leech collectors were also at the mercy of nature. Swamps weren't exactly safe places. There were snakes, biting insects, and the ever-present risk of drowning in deep mud. And leeches weren't infinite. Over-collection sometimes wiped out local populations, forcing collectors to travel farther and farther to find enough. Despite the suffering, this job kept the medical world supplied for centuries. Hospitals, traveling doctors, and even royal physicians relied on leeches to treat patients. It's estimated that in 19th century France alone, 40 million leeches were used every single year. The demand was so high that leech collectors were both despised and desperately needed. By the late 1800s, when medicine finally started abandoning bloodletting as a cure-all, leech collecting declined. Today, leeches are still used in some specialized surgeries, but thankfully, no one has to stand in a swamp for hours to catch them. So the next time you see a leech on a nature hike and panic, remember there were people who willingly let dozens of them bite at once, all to keep the doctors of their day stocked up on the most popular cure in town.
Gong farmer. Midnight in a medieval city. While everyone sleeps, a man climbs down a ladder into a deep, stinking pit. The air is so foul it burns his throat. This is a gong farmer, and his entire job is digging out the human waste that everyone else would rather forget existed. In medieval England, cities didn't have modern plumbing. People used privies, cesspits, and chamber pots, and all of that waste had to go somewhere. It couldn't just sit there forever. Eventually, the pits filled up.
That's when gong farmers were called in. The word gong comes from an old term meaning to go, as in, you can guess what. Their work was as simple as it was revolting. Armed with shovels, buckets, and ropes, gong farmers climbed down into cesspits to shovel out layer after layer of human waste. They worked by candlelight or torchlight deep underground, surrounded by filth. The smell was legendary. People wrote about it being so bad that even passing near cesspit could make you gag, and gong farmers spent hours inside them. Because of the unbearable stench, this job was usually done at night. Farmers would fill buckets with waste, haul them out, and cart the contents outside the city to be dumped on fields as fertilizer. It was dangerous work. Cesspits could collapse, filling with liquid waste and drowning the workers inside. The gases could also be deadly. Methane and ammonia built up in the pits, and one wrong move with a torch could cause an explosion. And yet, this job was essential. Without gong farmers, cities would have been unlivable. Waste would overflow into streets, spreading disease faster than it already did. Ironically, because their work was so vital, gong farmers were often paid pretty well compared to other laborers. But money couldn't buy them respect. Socially, gong farmers were treated like untouchables. People avoided them during the day, and some cities even forced them to live outside the walls. The stench of their work clung to their clothes and skin no matter how hard they tried to wash it off. If you passed one on the street, you'd know it immediately. The risk of disease was constant. Cuts and scrapes could become infected, and with no protective gear, farmers were exposed to everything from dysentery to typhoid. Many didn't live long, but those who did became hardened veterans of one of the foulest jobs in history. Next time you flush a toilet, think about the gong farmers who did this work by hand. They kept medieval cities from drowning in their own waste, and did it night after night in darkness and stench most of us couldn't stand for a single minute. Rat catcher. Something scurries across the floor. In a medieval city, that sound meant trouble, and it was the rat catcher's job to chase it down before disaster struck. This wasn't just pest control. This was life or death work during a time when rats were blamed for carrying the plague. Rat catchers were the unsung heroes, and sometimes the most feared men of crowded towns and villages. Their job was exactly what it sounds like: hunt, trap, and kill as many rats as possible to keep infestations under control. In cities packed with people, food scraps, and filth, rats were everywhere. And where rats went, fleas followed, fleas that spread the Black Death. To catch them, rat catchers used whatever tools they had: traps, dogs, cats, even ferrets trained to chase rats out of hiding. Some carried sticks or clubs and simply bashed the rat to death. Others used poison, though that was risky. Poison could contaminate food supplies and kill pets. Rat catchers were paid per tail, which meant the more gruesome their haul, the better their paycheck. This was not a safe job. Rat bites were common, and they could easily get infected. If the fleas on those rats were carrying plague, the catcher could get sick and die within days. Imagine crawling through filthy alleys, cellars, and sewers, hunting animals that could kill you just by being near them. And unlike modern pest control, there was no protective clothing. Most rat catchers worked bare-handed, with little more than boots and maybe a pair of gloves. The work was constant. There was no rat season. They bred year-round. Catchers often worked at night when the rodents were most active, creeping through dark streets lit only by a lantern. If they missed too many, food stores could be wiped out, disease could spread, and entire neighborhoods could panic. Rat catchers had a strange reputation. People relied on them, but they were also feared. Some were suspected of breeding rats secretly to keep business going, a medieval version of job security. Others became minor celebrities, walking through town with their sacks of dead rats like trophies, earning cheers from grateful townsfolk. Despite the danger, the job could pay surprisingly well. In plague years, cities were desperate and would pay anything to keep rat populations down. But no amount of money could completely protect a catcher from what he was hunting. Many died young, either from disease or from accidents in the filthy places they worked. So next time you see a single rat in the subway and feel grossed out, remember that there were once men who made their living wading into entire swarms of them with nothing but a stick and a sack, gambling every night with their own lives just to keep the town safe.
Matchstick Girl. Her jaw begins to glow faintly in the dark, and not in a magical way. Soon the pain sets in, the bone rots, and part of her face literally dies. This was the fate of thousands of Victorian matchstick girls, whose job making matches slowly poisoned them from the inside out. In 19th century London, matches were big business. Everyone needed them for lamps, stoves, candles, and factories sprang up to meet the demand. The people who made these matches were often young women and girls, some as young as 12. They worked long hours, dipping matchsticks into a chemical solution containing white phosphorus, which was cheap, effective, and unbelievably toxic. The job sounded simple. Take wooden sticks, dip the tips into phosphorus paste, dry them, and bundle them up for sale. But every step exposed workers to fumes that seeped into their bodies. The factories were hot, cramped, and full of chemical vapor. There was no ventilation, no protective gear, and no one warning these girls that what they were breathing was slowly killing them. After a few months on the job, the first symptoms appeared: toothaches, jaw pain, and swelling. This was the start of a phossy jaw, a condition where the phosphorus literally ate away at the jawbone. The smell was horrendous, like rotting flesh. As the disease progressed, pieces of bone could fall out, leaving gaping holes. The pain was so intense that some sufferers begged to have their jaws surgically removed just to get relief. And this wasn't rare. It was common enough that entire neighborhoods knew the smell of a match girl suffering from phosphorus poisoning. Many were dismissed from work once the condition became obvious. No compensation, no help, just sent home to die slowly. The match girls were some of the lowest paid workers in London, earning barely enough to survive.
Their workdays lasted up to 14 hours, and if they missed a shift, they risked being replaced. They endured chemical burns on their hands, constant coughing, and the ever-present fear of developing phossy jaw. But here's where the story takes a turn. In 1888, the Match Girls of London went on strike, one of the earliest successful strikes in labor history. They protested their dangerous working conditions and starvation wages, and against all odds, they won. The strike drew public attention to phosphorus poisoning, forcing match companies to improve conditions and eventually switch to a safer, non-toxic form of phosphorus. The job of matchstick girl faded away as safety standards improved, but their fight changed labor rights forever. So the next time you light a match, remember, there was a time when doing that simple job could cost you your face and your life. These girls literally gave pieces of themselves so the world could have fire at the strike of a stick.
Chimney sweep boys. You're crawling through a pitch-black tunnel barely wider than your shoulders. The air is thick with soot. Your knees are scraped raw and you can't breathe. Suddenly, you get stuck, and no one can hear you over the roar of the fire below. This was the terrifying life of the chimney sweep boys of Victorian England. Chimney sweeping sounds almost quaint today, but in the 18th and 19th centuries, it was deadly serious work, and it was done by children. These boys, some as young as 6, were sent up narrow brick chimneys to scrape away soot that could otherwise start house fires. The job was dangerous, filthy, and often fatal. Here's how it worked. The master sweep would send a boy into the chimney armed with little more than a brush or scraper. The boy would climb up by bracing his back, elbows, and knees against the walls, shimmying up inch by inch, dislodging soot as he went. The chimneys were often hot from fires that had recently been put out, and sometimes not fully extinguished, so burns were common. Soot would rain down into the boy's face, coating his eyes, nose, and mouth. Breathing was nearly impossible, and coughing fits were constant. Some boys suffocated inside chimneys when the soot built up too quickly, or when they simply got stuck. The phrase, "climbing boy's death," was a grimly common term in those days. And the hazards didn't end there. The constant exposure to soot caused horrific health problems. Many sweeps developed a painful, deadly cancer of the scrotum known as chimney sweep's carcinoma, one of the first recognized occupational cancers in history. Their lungs were often ruined by the time they were teenagers, leaving them with chronic coughs and breathing problems for life. The working conditions were brutal. Boys were sometimes forced up chimneys with whippings if they refused, and some masters lit small fires at the base of the chimney to encourage them to climb faster. They worked long days, crawling through multiple chimneys in a single shift, until their bodies were exhausted and blackened head to toe. Society largely looked the other way because clean chimneys meant fewer house fires, and that meant safer cities. It wasn't until campaigns by reformers in the 19th century that laws were passed to ban the use of child sweeps, and even then, the laws were widely ignored for years. Chimney sweeping eventually became safer with the invention of long mechanical brushes that could be used from below. But for decades, countless children were sacrificed to keep fires burning safely in wealthy homes. So next time you see a quaint Victorian drawing of a chimney sweep, remember, Behind the soot-stained smile was often a terrified child risking his life in a dark, airless tunnel, all to keep someone else's hearth warm.
Coal miner. The air is so thick with dust you can barely see the lantern in front of you. The ground shakes with every pickaxe strike, and somewhere deep in the tunnel you hear a groan. Maybe wood supports bending, maybe the earth itself about to collapse. Welcome to the life of a coal miner in the pre-modern era, one of the most brutal and unforgiving jobs in history. Coal was the lifeblood of the Industrial Revolution. It powered steam engines, heated homes, and ran factories. But getting it out of the earth was a nightmare. Miners spent their days underground, in cramped, pitch-black tunnels. They worked by candlelight or with dim oil lamps, chipping away at coal with hand tools. The ceilings were so low that many miners crawled on hands and knees for hours at a time. And the dangers? They were everywhere. Cave-ins were common, and once a tunnel collapsed, there was often no way out. Miners could be trapped for days or simply crushed where they stood. Even when the tunnels held, there was the constant risk of gas explosions. Methane could build up silently in the air, and a single spark, even from a miner's lamp, could ignite it, killing dozens in an instant. Then there was coal dust. It filled the air so thickly that miners breathed it in with every breath. Over time, the dust built up in their lungs, causing what became known as black lung disease. It wasn't just a cough, it was slow suffocation. Many miners barely lived to see middle age, their lungs scarred and failing. The physical toll was enormous. Miners hauled heavy loads of coal, pushed carts through narrow passages, and climbed ladders with their backs bent double. Injuries were constant. Crushed fingers, broken bones, and burns from underground fires. And if you were a child miner, yes, children worked in the mines too, you might spend your entire shift just opening and closing ventilation doors, sitting alone in the dark for 12 hours straight. Despite all of this, the pay was barely enough to survive. Mining towns often paid workers in scrip, a kind of company currency that could only be spent at the company store, which meant miners were often in permanent debt to their employers. Entire families worked in the mines just to keep food on the table. Coal mining wasn't just a job, it was a sentence. Generations of families were trapped in it because there was no other work available. Some miners became folk heroes for striking or fighting back against unsafe conditions, but progress came slowly, and for many, too late. So, the next time you flip on a light switch, think about the generations of miners who dug in darkness so the world above could live in light. Men who faced explosions, cave-ins, and slow death by suffocation just to keep the fires of industry burning.
Mercury miner. The air glitters faintly in the torchlight, but it's not magic. It's poison. Every breath you take is slowly killing you. Welcome to Almadén, Spain, home to the world's largest mercury mine, where generations of miners paid for their work with their lives. Mercury, also called quicksilver, was once one of the most valuable substances on Earth. It was used in medicine, alchemy, and especially in extracting silver and gold from ore. The Almaden mines produced more mercury than anywhere else for centuries, and keeping them running meant sending wave after wave of workers underground to dig it out. But mercury isn't just another metal. It's highly toxic. Inhaling its vapors or handling it for long periods leads to mercury poisoning, a slow, painful process that attacks the nervous system. And the Almaden mines were practically death traps. The miners worked in stifling tunnels filled with toxic fumes, swinging pickaxes and hauling out heavy loads of cinnabar ore, mercury sulfide. The heat was unbearable and ventilation was poor, so the air was thick with poisonous dust. The symptoms came on gradually. First came tremors in the hands, then headaches, drooling, and muscle weakness. Over time, miners developed mood swings, memory loss, and hallucinations, earning mercury the nickname the mad metal. Eventually, their teeth fell out, their gums turned black, and many became too weak to stand. Death was slow and miserable. This wasn't just an occupational hazard, it was almost guaranteed. Many miners didn't last more than a few years before mercury poisoning claimed them. And it wasn't only free laborers working here. Convicts and enslaved people were often forced into the mines as punishment. Being sentenced to Almaden was essentially a death sentence. The cruelty didn't stop underground. The processing of cinnabar involved heating the ore to release mercury vapors, which were then condensed into liquid metal. The furnaces belched poisonous gas, and the workers tending them were exposed just as heavily as the miners. Some dropped dead on the spot from acute exposure. Despite the horror, the mines stayed active for centuries because the demand for mercury never stopped. The Spanish crown relied on Almaden mercury to fuel its silver production in the Americas, which in turn fueled its empire. In other words, entire global economies ran on the backs of poisoned miners. It wasn't until the 20th century that modern safety measures and technology finally made the mine less deadly. But by then, countless lives had been lost. So next time you see the smooth, silvery shimmer of liquid mercury in a science video, remember that it once came from places like Almaden, where men walked into the earth, breathed poison every day, and knew they were trading years of life for every pound of quicksilver they dug up.
Sulfur miner. The air burns your throat with every breath. Smoke rises from the ground in thick yellow clouds, stinging your eyes until they water. And now you have to hoist 90 pounds of rock onto your shoulders and climb a mountain with it. This is the brutal life of a sulfur miner, a job so hellish it looks like something straight out of mythology. Sulfur mining has been around for centuries, from the volcanic fields of Sicily to the craters of Indonesia. The work is the same no matter where it happens. harvest bright yellow chunks of sulfur from active volcanic vents and carry them out by hand. There's no fancy machinery, no protective gear, just picks, baskets, and sheer endurance. The job begins at the edge of a volcano. Miners walk into areas where boiling steam vents hiss from the earth, releasing clouds of toxic gas. The smell is overpowering, like rotten eggs, and the fumes contain sulfur dioxide that can choke you or burn your lungs if you breathe too deeply. Miners break off chunks of solidified sulfur with simple tools, often while standing in scalding heat that can blister skin in minutes. Once the sulfur is broken free, the real torture begins, carrying it out. Miners load baskets with up to 90 or even 100 pounds of sulfur, sometimes more, and balance them across their shoulders. Then they begin the slow, grueling climb up steep, rocky slopes or out of crater floors. Some paths are several miles long, and the weight is enough to permanently deform a person's back over time. The dangers go beyond just the heat and the fumes. Volcanic gas vents can suddenly release bursts of poisonous smoke, knocking miners unconscious or killing them on the spot. Sulfur deposits can crumble underfoot, sending miners tumbling into boiling pools or jagged rock. And the long-term health effects are devastating. Chronic lung problems, damaged eyesight, and arthritis from years of carrying heavy loads. Yet, despite the danger, sulfur mining remains one of the only ways for many workers to earn a living in these regions. The pay is often shockingly low, sometimes just a few dollars for an entire day of backbreaking labor. Many miners start young and continue until their bodies simply can't handle it anymore. Tourists who visit volcanic sites are often shocked to see these miners at work, trudging past with shoulders scarred and calloused from years of hauling sulfur. But for the miners, this isn't a spectacle, it's survival. So the next time you see a photograph of those bright, beautiful yellow sulfur crystals, remember they were carved out of the earth by someone risking their lungs, their back, and sometimes their life to bring them to the surface, one basket at a time. Guano collector. The stench hits you before you even see the island. It burns your nose, stings your throat, and makes your stomach turn. But you keep going, because your job is to scrape mountains of bird poop under a blazing sun until you can barely breathe. Welcome to the life of a guano collector in 19th century Peru. Guano might sound funny, but it was once one of the most valuable substances on Earth. It's the accumulated droppings of seabirds, thick, crusty layers of it that piled up over centuries on islands off the Peruvian coast. Turns out, guano is an incredible fertilizer, packed with nitrates that make crops grow like magic. And in the 1800s, countries around the world were desperate for it. Harvesting it, though, was another story. Workers, often poor laborers or even indentured servants, were shipped out to guano islands and put to work digging, scraping, and hauling the dried droppings into sacks. These layers weren't thin. They could be dozens of feet deep, and the collectors had to chip away at it with pickaxes under the scorching sun. The smell was overwhelming. The ammonia fumes rising from the guano could make your eyes water and your chest tighten. Breathing it all day caused headaches, coughing fits, and nosebleeds. Some workers fainted from the fumes or from sheer heat exhaustion. There was no real protection, no masks, no gloves, nothing but a shovel and brute strength. And the job wasn't just disgusting, it was dangerous. The cliffs were steep, and workers sometimes fell to their deaths while digging along the edges. Ships had to constantly ferry away sacks of guano, and if you didn't keep up with the quota, there were punishments. Many of the workers weren't there by choice. China, for example, sent thousands of indentured laborers to the Guano Islands, where they lived under harsh conditions, guarded and unable to leave until their contracts were up. Some never made it home. Despite the misery, guano was so profitable that entire wars were fought over it. Literally. The so-called guano wars were about controlling access to these islands and their precious fertilizer deposits. Imagine risking your life shoveling bird droppings just so two nations could argue over who got rich from selling it. By the early 20th century, chemical fertilizers replaced natural guano as the world's main source of nitrates, and the industry declined. But for decades, this filthy trade helped feed booming populations around the world. So the next time you see a bag of garden fertilizer, think about the men who once dug through mountains of bird droppings, choking on ammonia, under the brutal sun, just to keep the world's farms productive. It may have been the most lucrative crop job in history, and that's not a figure of speech.
Breaker boy. Your fingers are bleeding, but you can't stop. The foreman is watching, and if you miss a rock, someone could lose their job. You sit hunched over a moving conveyor of coal for 12 hours straight, picking out sharp stones with your bare hands. You're 9 years old. This was the life of a breaker boy in 19th century America. Breaker boys worked in coal breakers, massive, noisy buildings where raw coal was crushed and sorted before being shipped out. Their job was simple but brutal. Sit on wooden planks above the conveyor belts and separate slate, rock, and other impurities from the coal as it passed by. The work was mind-numbing, repetitive, and dangerous, but it was considered a cheap solution to keep coal shipments clean. There were no gloves, no protective gear. The boys' fingers were constantly cut and bruised from handling sharp pieces of rock. Coal dust coated their skin, got into their eyes, and filled their lungs with every breath. Coughing was constant, and many developed black lung even before they became adults. The noise inside the breaker was deafening, with machinery clattering all day long. Communication was nearly impossible, but discipline was harsh. Boys were often beaten or fired if they were caught talking, joking, or missing too many pieces of rock. Some were so small they could barely reach the conveyor, yet they were expected to keep up with the older kids. Accidents were common. Fingers and hands could get caught in the moving machinery, sometimes leading to crushed bones or amputations. Falling into the coal chutes was a death sentence. The machinery wouldn't stop in time to save anyone who slipped. The workday was long, dawn to dusk, 6 days a week. Pay was pitiful, just a few cents a day. But for poor immigrant families, it was often the only way to survive. Entire childhoods were spent inside the breaker house, breathing dust and squinting in the dim light. Some boys used the job as a stepping stone, literally,
to work their way up to better paying positions as mule drivers or even miners. But many never escaped the system, spending their entire lives in the coal industry, sick and worn down before they reached 30. The cruelty of the breaker system eventually drew public outrage. Reformers began campaigning to get children out of the breakers and into spools, and by the early 20th century, laws were passed banning most child labor in the mines. But those laws came too late for the generations of kids who had already paid with their health and sometimes their lives. So next time you hear the phrase child labor, remember the breaker boys. Rows of exhausted children sitting over conveyor belts, hands raw and black with coal dust, working not for a future, but just to keep their families from starving.
Salt pan laborer. The sun reflects off the ground so brightly, it's like staring into a mirror. Your eyes ache, your skin feels like it's on fire, and your feet are soaked in salty water that's eating away at your flesh. This was the daily reality for salt pan laborers, people who harvested salt by hand in some of the harshest conditions imaginable. Salt pans are shallow, man-made ponds where seawater is left to evaporate, leaving behind a crust of pure salt. Sounds simple, but the work of harvesting that salt was brutal. Laborers spent hours standing ankle-deep in brine, scraping and raking the salt into piles under an unforgiving sun. There was no shade, no rest, just blistering heat bouncing off white salt that magnified the sun's rays like a giant reflector. The exposure was punishing. The combination of sun and salt left workers' skin cracked, raw, and bleeding. Salt water doesn't just sting cuts. It keeps them from healing, turning small wounds into festering sores. The workers' hands and feet were often permanently damaged, covered in thick calluses or open wounds that never quite closed. Their eyes suffered too. The glare from the salt flats could cause temporary blindness if workers didn't squint or cover their faces. Some developed long-term vision problems just from years of staring at blinding white surfaces. And then there was dehydration. Standing in the heat all day with little access to fresh water was dangerous, and many laborers fainted from heat stroke or exhaustion. Despite the pain, salt was worth its weight in gold, literally. For centuries it was so valuable that it was used as currency, which meant salt pan laborers were essential to society. Yet they rarely saw any of that wealth. Most were poor laborers, forced to work long hours for barely enough pay to survive. And the work didn't stop just because it was dangerous. If storms came, laborers had to rush to protect the salt from being washed away. If the water didn't evaporate fast enough, they had to keep working longer hours to break up and collect what they could. The job was constant, exhausting, and endless. In some parts of the world, salt pan labor is still done by hand today, and conditions haven't improved much. Modern salt workers often face the same blistering sun, untreated wounds, and meager wages. It's one of those jobs that has barely changed in hundreds of years.
Quicksilver gold refiner. The gold gleams in your hand, but your gums are bleeding. Your hands won't stop shaking, and you can barely think straight. That's the price of being a quicksilver gold refiner. a job that slowly poisoned workers with mercury while they helped fuel gold rushes and royal treasuries. For centuries, mercury, known as quicksilver, was the secret weapon of gold and silver mining. When mixed with crushed ore, mercury forms an amalgam that traps the gold particles. Heat it up, and the mercury burns away, leaving behind pure, beautiful gold. On paper, it was brilliant. In practice, it was deadly. Refiners worked with mercury constantly, often with their bare hands. They would crush rock into powder, pour mercury over it, and knead the mixture together until the gold was absorbed. Then came the most dangerous step, heating the amalgam over open flames to evaporate the mercury. The toxic vapors filled the air, and without ventilation or masks, workers inhaled it all. The effects of mercury poisoning crept in slowly but relentlessly. The first signs were trembling hands and slurred speech. Then came mouth ulcers, tooth loss, and uncontrollable drooling. Long-term exposure attacked the nervous system, causing memory loss, irritability, and hallucinations. Symptoms so common they inspired the phrase "mad as a hatter," which originally referred to mercury poisoning in hat makers, but applied just as well to refiners. And there was no escape. Refiners handled mercury day after day, soaking their skin in it, breathing its fumes, and contaminating their food and water without even realizing it. Many died young, their bodies wasted by years of exposure. Those who survived often had permanent neurological damage, leaving them unable to work or even think properly. But despite the danger, quicksilver refining was essential. During the Spanish colonial era, massive refining operations in the Americas used this process to extract silver and gold on an industrial scale. The wealth built entire empires, but at a staggering human cost. Indigenous laborers and enslaved people were often forced to work the refineries knowing that the job was a slow death sentence. Even during gold rushes, prospectors happily risked mercury exposure for a chance at striking it rich. The drive for gold was so powerful that few cared about the long-term effects until it was too late. Today, mercury refining is largely banned or strictly controlled, but illegal gold mining in parts of the world still uses the exact same method, poisoning rivers, soil, and the workers themselves. So the next time you see a gold ring or a shiny coin, remember that for centuries people literally traded their health, their teeth, and their sanity to create that glittering treasure. The gold was pure, but the price was deadly.
Asbestos mill worker. The air looks harmless, just a soft white dust floating in the sunlight, but every breath you take is filling your lungs with tiny, deadly fibers. This was the life of an asbestos mill worker, long before anyone knew that this miracle mineral was slowly killing them. Asbestos was once considered a wonder material. It was fireproof, strong, and cheap, so factories used it in everything from insulation and roofing to brake pads and even clothing. To get it ready for industry, raw asbestos rock had to be crushed, ground, and spun into fibers. And that's where the mill workers came in. Inside the mills, the air was thick with dust.
Workers shoveled asbestos into crushers, fed it into spinning machines, and bagged it for shipping. There were no masks, no ventilation systems, just clouds of fine needle-like fibers coating every surface. The dust clung into hair, skin, and clothing so completely that workers often went home looking like ghosts. Their families would even get exposed when they hugged them at the door or washed their clothes. At first, no one noticed the danger. The work was hard and dirty, but it paid steady wages. But after a few years, workers began to cough, a dry, hacking cough that never went away. Their chests hurt, breathing became harder, and many developed a strange crackling sound in their lungs. Some died young from what doctors called fibrosis of the lungs, not realizing it was caused by asbestos dust. The real horror is that the damage didn't stop when the job did. Asbestos fibers stayed in the lungs for decades, slowly scarring the tissue and sometimes triggering aggressive cancers like mesothelioma years later. This meant many mill workers who survived long enough to retire still faced a death sentence from the job they had left behind. And yet, for decades, asbestos was everywhere. Mill workers were the invisible first link in a global chain that built ships, schools, homes, and factories out of asbestos-containing materials. Society praised the fireproofing power of asbestos, while the people who handled it daily were literally sacrificing their breath. When the connection between asbestos and disease became undeniable in the mid-20th century, lawsuits and bans followed. But by then, entire generations of workers had already been exposed. Many industries fought to downplay the risks for years, keeping mills running even as death rates climbed. Today, asbestos use is banned or strictly regulated in most countries, but its legacy lingers in the form of contaminated buildings and in the lungs of former workers. So the next time you hear asbestos mentioned in a news story, remember the mill workers, men and women who stood in blizzards of deadly dust, day after day, never knowing that every breath was quietly cutting years off their lives.
Night soil man. You think your job stinks? Try spending every night knee-deep in other people's waste. That was the life of the night soil man, the unfortunate soul tasked with cleaning out cesspits and privies before cities had modern plumbing. In the days before flush toilets and sewers, human waste didn't just disappear. It collected in pits under houses and outhouses. Eventually, those pits filled up and someone had to empty them. Enter the night soil man. His job was to dig, scoop, and haul the waste away, usually working under the cover of darkness, so the neighbors didn't have to see or smell what was happening. The work was filthy beyond imagination. Night soil men climbed down into cesspits with shovels, buckets, and lanterns. They shoveled out the contents, politely called night soil, and passed the buckets up to be dumped into carts. The smell was overpowering, a mix of ammonia and rot so strong it could make grown men vomit on the spot. Some workers tied cloths soaked in vinegar over their faces just to make it bearable. And this wasn't just gross, it was dangerous. The pits could collapse, trapping or drowning workers in the muck. Toxic gases built up inside the pits, and one wrong move with the lantern could cause an explosion. Even without disasters, night soil men were constantly exposed to diseases like cholera and typhoid. Despite the danger, the job was crucial. Without them,
entire cities would have been overrun with waste. Their work kept streets somewhat cleaner and reduced the spread of disease, though many still saw them as unclean and untouchable. Night saw men were often forced to live on the outskirts of town, and their very presence could clear a street faster than the smell they left behind. Ironically, in some places, their work was also valuable. The waste they collected was sometimes sold to farmers as fertilizer. In parts of Asia, night soil collection was so organized it became an important part of the agricultural economy. Still, the men doing the actual collection rarely got much respect or decent pay for their trouble. Night soil collection continued in many cities well into the 19th century until indoor plumbing and sewer systems finally made the job obsolete. But for centuries, it was one of the dirtiest, most thankless jobs a person could have, and society literally depended on it. So the next time you flush a toilet and forget about it, take a moment to appreciate the night soil men. They were the original sanitation workers, the invisible heroes of public health, even if they probably never got within 10 feet of polite company after a night on the job.
Resurrectionists. The shovel hits wood with a dull thud. You freeze, listening for dogs, for watchmen, for anything that might give you away. Then you pry open the coffin, wrap a rope around the corpse, and drag it out under the moonlight. Congratulations, you're a resurrectionist, and your night is just getting started. In the 18th and 19th centuries, medical schools were desperate for human bodies to study. Dissection was essential for teaching doctors anatomy, but the law only allowed a very small number of bodies, usually those of executed criminals, to be used for this purpose. That meant the supply didn't even come close to meeting demand. The solution? Hire people to resurrect the recently dead. Resurrectionists, also called body snatchers, were hired to sneak into graveyards at night and dig up fresh corpses. They had to work fast because families sometimes hired guards or even built iron cages called mort safes over graves to keep body thieves away. The resurrectionists would dig down to the coffin, break it open, and haul out the body. They usually left behind the clothing and jewelry because stealing those counted as robbery, while taking just the body was technically a legal gray area in many places. The work was grueling. Digging through several feet of earth in the middle of the night was hard enough, but doing it quietly and quickly was even harder. The stench of freshly buried bodies was overpowering, and the risk of being caught was constant. If townsfolk found them in the act, resurrectionists could be beaten, jailed, or even lynched on the spot. But the payoff was good, at least by working-class standards. Medical schools paid handsomely for fresh cadavers, especially those of young, healthy individuals who were valuable for teaching. The fresher the body, the better, which meant resurrectionists often struck within 24 to 48 hours of burial. The job got darker in some cases. In the infamous Burke and Hare murders in Scotland, the men didn't bother waiting for people to die. They killed victims themselves and sold the bodies. That scandal horrified the public and led to new laws, like the Anatomy Act of 1832 in Britain, which allowed medical schools to use unclaimed bodies legally, ending much of the resurrection trade. Still, for decades, Resurrectionists were a grim but necessary part of medical progress. Without them, doctors wouldn't have had enough bodies to learn their craft, and medicine would have advanced much more slowly. So next time you see a medical drama with a perfectly clean cadaver on a table, think about the men who used to dig through churchyards at night, risking prison, angry mobs, and worse, just to deliver a body before it was too late. They may have been grave robbers, but they were also the unlikely suppliers of modern medical science. Plague doctor's assistant. The smell of smoke mixes with the smell of death. You grip a bundle of filthy sheets with gloved hands and toss them into the fire. Somewhere behind you, a patient coughs, a deep, rattling sound that means they won't live until morning. You are the plague doctor's assistant, and you spend every day one step away from joining the dead you're trying to help. When plague swept through Europe, cities turned to plague doctors to contain the epidemic. But those doctors didn't work alone. They had assistants, and those assistants did the dirtiest, most dangerous jobs. Their work wasn't glamorous like diagnosing patients or writing medical reports. It was cleaning, disinfecting, and burning everything that might carry the disease. Their day started with collecting contaminated items from plague houses, bedding, clothing, rags, even furniture. They had to touch everything the sick had touched, dragging it out of homes while trying not to breathe too deeply. There were no real hazmat suits, just layers of cloth, waxed coats, and the faint hope that a mask stuffed with herbs might keep the plague away. Once collected, the assistant's job was to destroy or disinfect the items. Some were boiled in lye, others smoked with burning herbs, and many were simply thrown into giant bonfires. The smell was choking, a mix of burning fabric, rot, and smoke that clung to their hair and clothes. It wasn't just objects they handled. Assistants also helped move bodies, sometimes still warm, into plague pits. They shoveled lime over the corpses to slow the spread of disease, and sometimes helped seal up houses where whole families had died. They were exposed to plague fleas, contaminated air, and infected blood almost constantly. The risk was enormous. Plague killed fast, sometimes within days, and even a small cut on the assistant's hand could mean certain death. Many didn't survive long in the job, but someone had to do it, or the city would drown in filth and infection. The work was isolating, too. People avoided plague workers out of fear they carried the disease. Some assistants were banned from public gatherings, forced to live in separate quarters, and even shunned after epidemics ended. It was as if touching death every day made them permanently untouchable. Despite the danger, these assistants were crucial to stopping outbreaks. Every mattress they burned, every rag they boiled, and every cartload of contaminated clothes they hauled away slowed the spread of disease just enough to save lives. So the next time you see an image of a plague doctor in their creepy beaked mask, remember there was usually someone standing next to them, an assistant covered in sweat and soot, working silently, knowing that if they made one mistake, they'd be the next body in the pit.
Dog whipper. The sermon has just begun when a scruffy dog trots down the aisle. The congregation gasps and you spring into action, whip in hand. Welcome to the bizarre job of the dog whipper, the medieval church worker whose entire job was to keep animals, and sometimes unruly people, out of holy spaces. Back in the Middle Ages, churches were the center of village life, but they weren't exactly quiet, sacred spaces the way we imagine today. Doors were often open to everyone, including dogs, cats, pigs, and even wandering livestock. Imagine trying to listen to a priest's sermon while a goat is chewing on someone's kluk. Enter the dog whipper. Armed with a whip or a long stick with a leather strap, this person patrolled the church during services, keeping an eye out for any four-legged intruders. If a dog wandered in, the whipper would chase it out, usually with a loud crack of the whip or a quick strike on the back. Some even had small wooden tongs to grab the animal by the neck and haul it outside. But this job wasn't just about dogs. Sometimes the whipper was called on to remove rowdy children, drunks, or anyone who was causing a disturbance during Mass. It wasn't exactly a prestigious job, but it was necessary. After all, you couldn't have animals running around the altar while the priest was performing the Eucharist. The work could be surprisingly dangerous. Not every dog left quietly. Some fought back, biting and scratching. Getting rabies was a very real risk, and in a time before vaccines, a single bite could mean a slow, agonizing death. The whipper also risked angering parishioners if he roughed up their animals. Some villages even had to replace their dog whippers regularly because of how unpopular the job made them. Despite this, dog whippers were considered essential. Churches often paid them a small wage or gave them a place to live. In some places, they were even given a special seat in the church so they could jump into action quickly. The position eventually disappeared as churches became more regulated and animals were kept out more consistently. By the 18th century, most churches no longer needed someone to patrol for dogs, but a few ceremonial dog whipper posts survived as quirky traditions. It's a strange piece of history that shows how chaotic everyday life could be, even in a place meant for solemn prayer. So next time your dog misbehaves in public, imagine being dragged out of church by a man with a whip while the entire congregation watched. The dog whipper may not have been the most glamorous church official, but he kept Mass from turning into a barnyard free-for-all.
Medieval barber surgeon. The blade is sharp, the chair is hard, and there's no screaming allowed. Though you probably will anyway. You've just sat down in front of a medieval barber surgeon, a man who can give you a haircut, pull your teeth, or saw off your leg. All in the same afternoon. Before medicine became a true profession, barbers weren't just trimming beards. They were the go-to doctors for much of medieval Europe. Their shops were easy to find. Just look for the red and white striped pole outside. Those stripes? They weren't just decoration. They represented blood and bandages, proudly advertising that this barber could cut more than hair. A barber surgeon's skill set was a mix of grooming
and gruesome medical procedures. Need a tooth yanked? He'd do it with iron pliers, no numbing. Need blood living? He'd slice open a vein and let you bleed into a bowl, because people believed draining blood could cure fevers, headaches, and even bad humors. If you had an infected limb, he might cauterize it with hot irons, or worse, amputate it entirely. The tools were basic but terrifying: sharp knives, saws, hooks, and crude clamps. There were no anesthesia, so patients were held down by assistants while the barber worked as quickly as possible. The faster he cut, the more likely the patient would survive the shock. Even so, many died on the chair from blood loss, pain, or infection afterward. Barber surgeons also did battlefield work, patching up soldiers as best they could, with nothing but boiling water and whatever instruments they carried. They set broken bones, stitched up wounds, and sometimes performed trepanations, literally drilling holes into skulls to let out bad spirits. Despite the blood and danger, barber surgeons were an essential part of society. Monks and scholars weren't allowed to spill blood, so someone had to do the cutting. These men were practical, hands-on healers, though their success rate was questionable at best. Surviving a major procedure was often about luck than skill. Hygiene was almost non-existent. Instruments were rarely cleaned between patients, meaning infection spread like wildfire. If you survived the procedure, you still had to pray you wouldn't die of sepsis in the days that followed. Eventually, medicine split into two distinct professions. Surgeons became trained, educated professionals, and barbers went back to just cutting hair. But for centuries, these bloody multitaskers kept communities alive, or at least tried to. So the next time you see a cheerful barber pole spinning outside a shop, remember that it once meant something much darker. It marked the place where you could get a shave, a haircut, and, if you were unlucky, lose a limb, all in the same visit.
Hospital orderly. You're lying in a hospital bed, feverish and weak, when someone leans over to clean your wound with the same rag they used on another patient across the room. Congratulations, you've just been helped by a hospital orderly in the days before germ theory, and your odds of survival just got worse. Before scientists discovered that microscopic germs cause disease, hospitals were some of the most dangerous places you could go. They were crowded, dirty, and filled with the smell of blood and rot. The job of the hospital orderly was to keep things clean, but by today's standards, their work often did the exact opposite. Orderlies were the ones who changed bandages, washed wounds, carried pans, and hauled away soiled sheets. But they had no concept of sanitation. The same sponge might be used on patient after patient, spreading infection like wildfire. Surgical instruments were rarely washed, and gloves weren't even invented yet. The floors were often covered in filth. Blood, pus, and vomit weren't unusual sights, and it was the orderly's job to mop it up. Sometimes they simply swept it aside or rinsed it with dirty water, leaving a breeding ground for bacteria. Rats and insects were common, adding to the nightmare. Orderlies also had to deal with the bodies. When patients died, which was often, orderlies were the ones who carried them away, sometimes through wards filled with other sick patients. The smell of death never really left the building or the workers. The work was physically punishing and emotionally draining. Imagine spending your entire day surrounded by suffering, screams, and death, with no real tools to make anyone better. And orderlies were often poorly paid and barely trained, which meant mistakes were constant. The tragic part is that no one knew how dangerous this all was. Surgeons would operate in street clothes, orderlies would reuse blood-soaked bandages, and everyone assumed disease came from bad air, not invisible microbes. It wasn't until pioneers like Florence Nightingale and Joseph Lister pushed for better hygiene that things slowly began to change. Even after germ theory caught on, orderlies still faced enormous risk. They handled contagious patients daily with little more than aprons to protect themselves. Typhus, cholera, tuberculosis, all of these could spread easily in a crowded ward, and hospital staff were among the first to get sick when epidemics struck. Today, hospitals are some of the safest and most sterile places you can be, thanks in part to the lessons learned from those early deadly days. But back then, being a hospital orderly wasn't just a job. It was a gamble with your own life, every single shift. So the next time you see a nurse or hospital worker methodically sanitizing everything, remember that there once was a time when cleaning up meant spreading disease, and the orderlies were the ones doing it unknowingly, turning hospitals into death traps.
Knocker-up. Your alarm clock doesn't buzz. It knocks, literally. At 4 in the morning, a stick taps against your window again and again until you're awake. Congratulations, you've just been visited by a knocker-up, one of the strangest jobs to come out of Industrial Revolution England. Before alarm clocks were cheap and reliable, waking up on time was a serious problem. Factory shifts started early, often before dawn, and being late could mean losing pay or even getting fired. Enter the knocker-up, a human alarm clock whose entire job was to make sure you got out of bed. A typical knocker-up carried a long pole, sometimes as long as 10 feet, with a wire or knob on the end. They'd walk through dark streets, stopping outside their customers' homes, and tap, tap, tap on bedroom windows until they were sure the person inside was awake. If the window was too high, they'd use pea shooters to ping the glass until the sleeper stirred. This job was harder than it sounds. Knocker-ups had to work in all weather, rain, snow, fog, trudging through freezing streets long before sunrise. They memorized which houses to wake, at what times and in which order, because missing a house could mean angry customers and lost income. And they didn't just knock once and leave. If someone didn't respond, the knocker-up would keep tapping until they saw movement inside. The hours were brutal. Knocker-ups had to be out before everyone else, sometimes starting their rounds at 3:30 a.m. That meant their own sleep schedules were completely upside down. They were some of the few people awake while the entire town was still silent and dark.
Pay wasn't great, but it was steady. Customers subscribed to their service for a weekly fee, a few pennies per person, and some knocker-ups could make a decent living if they had enough houses on their route. In some towns, police officers took on the job as a side hustle while walking their night patrols. The job came with its own set of challenges. People who didn't want to get up would sometimes pretend not to hear the knocking, forcing knocker-ups to get creative. Some even built special contraptions that allowed them to knock louder or throw small stones with precision to really annoy a sleeper awake. The profession lasted surprisingly long, well into the 20th century in some places, before alarm clocks finally replaced them. By then, the knocker-up had become something of a local character, part of the fabric of working-class life. Today, the idea of paying someone to wake you up seems almost absurd, but in its time, it was a lifeline for factory workers trying to keep their jobs. So next time you groan about your alarm clock, remember, there was once a person standing in the freezing dark, poking your window until you woke up, and if you ignored them, they'd just keep knocking.
Mummy grinder. On a dusty workbench lies an ancient Egyptian mummy, and you're about to smash it to pieces. Not to study it, not to display it in a museum, but to turn it into powder that people will swallow as medicine. Welcome to the grim world of the mummy grinder, one of the strangest and most unsettling jobs in history. In the 16th through 19th centuries, Europe developed a bizarre fascination with ground-up mummies. People believed that consuming mummy powder could cure anything from headaches to internal bleeding. The thinking went that since mummies were preserved and ancient, they contained some kind of mystical life force, a power you could absorb by eating them. But where do you get enough mummy powder for an entire continent? That's where mummy grinders came in. They were tasked with taking imported mummies, often looted from Egyptian tombs, and literally grinding them down into dust. The work was dirty, smelly, and gruesome. Mummies weren't always perfectly preserved. Some were falling apart, wrapped in brittle, stinking cloth and caked with centuries-old resin. Grinders had to break apart the desiccated bodies, strip off the wrappings, and pulverize the remains into a fine powder using mortars, pestles, or even mills. Sometimes they didn't just use Egyptian mummies. When supply ran low, they resorted to recently buried bodies, criminals, or even animals. As long as it looked mummified, it could be sold. The smell must have been horrific. Imagine inhaling centuries-old dust from human remains day after day. Some workers likely got sick from breathing in the fine particles, which could carry bacteria or toxins. And of course, there was the psychological side. Spending your days dismembering corpses for profit couldn't have been easy on the mind. But the trade was profitable. Apothecaries sold mummy powder at high prices, and demand was so strong that some suppliers faked mummies by drying out fresh corpses. Customers didn't care. They wanted their cure, and they were willing to pay for it. Eventually, doctors began to doubt whether mummy powder actually worked, and public opinion shifted. By the 19th century, mummy grinding was considered outdated and a bit scandalous. Mummies became more valuable as museum pieces than as medicine, and the practice largely died out, though not before countless ancient bodies were destroyed in the name of health. Today, the idea of eating ground-up mummies sounds absurd and horrifying. But for centuries, it was considered perfectly normal, even fashionable. So, the next time you see a mummy behind glass at a museum, remember,
If you lived just a few hundred years ago, that mummy might have ended up in a jar, sold by the ounce, and stirred into someone's drink as a cure for whatever ailed them. Sewer flusher. You lower yourself into the darkness, lantern in hand. The smell hits first, thick, choking, and foul enough to make your eyes water. Waist deep in filth, you feel something shift in the black water. You can't turn back. The blockage has to be cleared. Welcome to the job of the sewer flusher in 19th century London. During the Victorian era, London's sewers were a nightmare. They were often clogged with everything from mud and dead animals to industrial waste and human excrement. Left untreated, the blockages caused raw sewage to back up into streets and homes, creating perfect conditions for cholera outbreaks. The only solution? Send men directly into the tunnels to clear the mess by hand. Sewer flushers were part of small teams who climbed down access shafts with long poles, shovels, and buckets. Their job was to locate the blockage, sometimes a mass of debris called a fatberg, and break it apart until the sewage could flow again. The tunnels were dark, narrow, and often barely tall enough to stand in. The air was foul and heavy, full of methane and other toxic gases that could knock a man unconscious without warning. And the dangers didn't stop there. Sewers sometimes flooded without warning, drowning workers before they could escape. There were also rats, millions of them, living off the endless supply of waste and ready to bite anything that moved. The men risked contracting every disease you can imagine: cholera, typhoid, dysentery, and they often did. The smell clung to them permanently. No amount of washing could remove the stench completely, and many sewer flushers were shunned in public for the way they smelled. It was a job no one wanted, but someone had to do it, because without them, whole neighborhoods could be wiped out by disease. Despite the danger, sewer flushers weren't paid much. They were usually poor laborers who took the work out of desperation. Many died young from infections, accidents, or toxic gas exposure, and yet their work was absolutely essential. They were the invisible line of defense between London's growing population and catastrophic epidemics. Ironically, the filth these men waded through eventually pushed the city to build one of the most advanced sewer systems in the world, designed by Joseph Bazalgette after the infamous Great Stink of 1858. That system made the job of the sewer flusher safer, but didn't make it pleasant. Even today, modern sewer workers still face dangerous conditions when they have to clear blockages manually. The difference is that now they have protective gear, breathing apparatus, and technology to make it safer, luxuries the Victorian flusher could only dream about. So next time you flush a toilet without thinking, remember that there were once men crawling through tunnels of human waste with nothing but a lantern and a shovel, risking their lives so the city above wouldn't drown in its own filth.
Plague bell ringer. A single bell tolls in the distance. Everyone in the street freezes. They know what's coming, the death cart. And walking just ahead of it is you, the plague bell ringer, warning the living that the dead are on their way. During outbreaks of plague, cities were overwhelmed with corpses. Entire families died within days,
and death carts made constant rounds to collect the bodies. But they didn't arrive silently. Ahead of the cart came the bell ringer, swinging a hand bell and calling out grim announcements like, "Bring out your dead." The sound of that bell struck terror into everyone who heard it. This job was part messenger, part warning system, and part public health measure. The bell ringer's job was to move through the streets, signaling people to bring out the bodies of relatives so they could be taken to mass graves. Sometimes they also read public notices or shouted instructions from the authorities, warnings about quarantine zones or orders to stay indoors. But this wasn't just sad work. It was dangerous. Bell ringers had to walk right into the heart of plague-stricken neighborhoods, often brushing past homes where the disease was still raging. The fleas that spread plague didn't care if you had a bell. They jumped on anyone they could reach. Many bell ringers fell sick themselves and ended up on the same death cart they once led. The job was also psychologically crushing. Imagine walking through silent streets, ringing a bell while people peered out of windows with fear in their eyes. The smell of death was everywhere. Sometimes bell ringers saw piles of bodies waiting at doors or had to help load them onto the carts. It wasn't just a job. It was a constant reminder that death was winning. The pay was often small, but in a desperate time, it was enough to tempt those who had no other options. Some were city employees, others were volunteers, or even press-ganged into service. It was considered a duty to keep the living informed and the dead moving, but no one envied the person who carried the bell. The sound of the plague bell became one of the most haunting symbols of the era. People came to associate it with fear, grief, and helplessness. Even after the outbreaks ended, some cities banned the use of handbells for years because the sound was too traumatic. So the next time you hear the distant ring of a bell, imagine being in a city where that sound meant death was at your door, literally. The plague bell ringer wasn't just announcing the arrival of a cart. They were announcing that another piece of the city had just been swallowed by the disease.
Powder monkey. Cannon fire shakes the deck. Smoke fills the air. You're a child, sprinting across the ship with a barrel of gunpowder in your arms, praying you don't trip. One spark, one stray bullet, and you'll go up in flames. This was the job of the powder monkey, one of the most dangerous roles on a warship. Powder monkeys were usually boys, some as young as 10 or 12, who worked on naval vessels during the age of sail. Their main duty was simple but deadly. Ferry gunpowder from the ship's magazine, a below-deck storage area, to the cannons during battle. Cannons couldn't fire without a constant supply of powder, and powder monkeys were the runners who kept the guns loaded. The job demanded speed and nerves of steel. Battles were chaotic. The ship shook with every broadside, cannonballs smashed through the hull, and splinters the size of swords flew through the air. The powder monkey had to dash through this chaos carrying containers of loose gunpowder or cartridges, avoiding fire, smoke, and enemy shot. The magazine itself was a death trap. It was kept dimly lit, sometimes only by lanterns inside glass boxes, because one stray spark could blow up the entire ship. Powder monkeys had to work barefoot or in soft shoes to avoid creating sparks. If an enemy cannonball struck the magazine while they were inside, there was no chance of survival. And they were prime targets. Enemy sharpshooters knew that if they picked off the powder monkeys, the cannons would go silent. That meant these children were deliberately shot at during battle. Some accounts describe powder monkeys being cut down mid-run, spilling powder across the deck while the gunners screamed for more. Even outside of battle, the job was exhausting. The boys had to clean powder residue, restock magazines, and train constantly. Life aboard a warship was cramped, dirty, and brutal, with strict discipline and harsh punishments. Yet, for many poor children, becoming a powder monkey was a way off the streets and sometimes a path to a better life. Some survived long enough to rise through the ranks, becoming sailors or even officers. But for many, their time as powder monkeys was short, either because of injury, death, or the sheer danger of the work. It's a haunting thought. In the middle of roaring naval battles, it was often children who kept the guns firing. They were fast, small, and expendable, qualities that made them perfect for a job no adult wanted. So, next time you watch a movie with cannons blasting, broadside after broadside, picture the terrified boy racing below deck, clutching a keg of powder as the ship shudders around him, knowing that if anything goes wrong, he'll be the first to die.
Trench latrine digger. The shells are falling in the distance. The mud is knee-deep, and the smell is unbearable. And your job isn't to fight. It's to dig a hole for everyone's waste. This was the life of the trench latrine digger, one of the least glamorous and most dehumanizing jobs on the front lines of World War I. Life in the trenches was hell. Soldiers lived shoulder to shoulder in narrow, muddy ditches that quickly filled with rats and lice and disease. With thousands of men crammed into a few miles of front, even something as basic as going to the bathroom became a logistical nightmare. That's where the latrine diggers came in. Their job was to dig and maintain the latrines, basically long, narrow pits where soldiers relieved themselves. These pits had to be far enough from living quarters to avoid contaminating water supplies, but close enough that soldiers could reach them quickly, even under fire. That meant the diggers were often working out in no man's land, or at least close enough to be targeted by enemy snipers and artillery. Digging was hard work under the best of conditions, but doing it in the trenches meant working in waterlogged soil, often at night, with explosions going off nearby. Sometimes diggers had to bail water out of the holes just to keep them usable. Then came the maintenance, spreading lime over the waste to keep the stench and disease somewhat under control, covering filled pits with dirt, and starting all over again somewhere else. The smell was relentless. In hot weather, the stench could travel for miles, clinging to everything, uniforms, food, even the air in the trenches. Diggers had to endure that smell all day long while still trying to avoid incoming shells.
One direct hit could turn their worksite into a nightmare of mud, blood, and sewage. And yet this job was vital. Without latrine diggers, the trenches would have become breeding grounds for dysentery, cholera, and other deadly diseases. Even with their work, outbreaks were common, but without them, entire units could have been wiped out by illness before they ever saw battle. It was thankless work. Soldiers rarely appreciated the diggers' efforts, and no one wanted to be assigned to the job. Many saw it as punishment duty, the worst detail you could get. But it kept the army functioning, literally. In a war remembered for its horrors, gas attacks, machine guns, endless mud, the trench latrine digger's job might sound small, but it was one of the most necessary roles in keeping men alive long enough to keep fighting. So, the next time you hear about trench warfare, remember the soldiers who weren't just dodging bullets, but also digging pits in the mud, shoveling lime over human waste, and doing it all while the enemy tried to blow them apart. It wasn't just dirty work. It was war work.
Munitions girl. You look down at your hands and see they're turning bright yellow. Your hair is changing color. Your skin glows under the factory lights, and it isn't makeup. It's poison seeping into your body. This was the life of the munitions girls, also known as the Canary Girls of World War I. When the men went off to fight, women filled the factories, producing the artillery shells and ammunition that kept the war going. It was dangerous work from the start. One wrong move could trigger an explosion. But the most insidious danger was invisible. TNT poisoning. Trinitrotoluene, or TNT, was the key ingredient in shells, and handling it day after day exposed workers to toxic chemicals. As the women filled and packed shells, TNT dust coated their hair, faces, and clothing. Over time, their skin literally turned a bright yellow-orange color, earning them the nickname Canary Girls after the small yellow birds. But the color change wasn't just cosmetic. TNT poisoning attacked their livers, causing nausea, dizziness, anemia, and in severe cases, death. Some women developed toxic jaundice, where their eyes and skin turned yellow as their organs began to fail. Others suffered miscarriages or gave birth to babies with health complications. And then there was the ever-present risk of explosion. The factories were full of volatile chemicals and explosives, and a single spark could level the entire building. Workers had to wear non-sparking shoes, avoid metal buttons, and even remove hairpins. Despite the precautions, accidents happened. Some factories were destroyed in catastrophic blasts, killing dozens of women at once. The conditions were harsh. The air was thick with chemical fumes, the hours were long, and the pay, while better than many other jobs available to women, came at a terrible cost. Many Canary Girls kept working even as their health deteriorated, driven by patriotism, necessity, or the promise of wages their families depended on. For some, the work was empowering. It was the first time many women had earned their own money or played a crucial role in a national effort. But for others, the job became a slow death sentence, with symptoms that worsened the longer they stayed. When the war ended, many munitions girls were simply sent home, their health permanently damaged, their yellow skin slowly fading, but the effects lingering for years. Some were celebrated as heroes, but most received little compensation for the risks they had taken. Today, the story of the Canary Girls is remembered as both a tale of courage and a grim reminder of what total war demanded from those on the home front. So the next time you see an image of women proudly working in wartime factories, think of the Canary Girls, glowing yellow under the factory lights, smiling for the camera, even as the poison that kept the war machine running was quietly killing them from the inside.
Human alarm clock. The streets are silent, except for your footsteps. The moon is your only light. Somewhere in the darkness, a door creaks, and you grip your staff a little tighter. You're not just keeping time tonight. You're keeping yourself alive. This was the life of the night watchman, the human alarm clock and first line of defense in dangerous towns. Long before police forces existed, every town needed someone to keep order after dark. Night watchmen were hired, sometimes by the town, sometimes by neighborhoods, to patrol the streets, call out the hours, and make sure fires, thieves, or drunks didn't get out of control. Their rounds were slow and lonely. They'd carry a lantern and a wooden staff or club, walking the same routes night after night. Every hour or so, they'd stop and call out the time, "Past midnight and all is well," to reassure the town that someone was watching over them. In a way, they were human alarm clocks, keeping people aware of the passing hours and alerting them if trouble came. But the job wasn't just about announcing the time. Watchmen had to deal with anything that happened in the dark. House fires, fights, break-ins, and lost travelers. They were the first responders of their day, often completely on their own. If they ran into a violent criminal or a drunken gang, they had to handle it themselves or raise the alarm loud enough for others to help. And that meant they were often in real danger. Town streets were risky after dark, especially in rough neighborhoods. Bandits and pickpockets knew watchmen carried little more than a club and maybe a whistle, so they could become targets themselves. Some were beaten, robbed, or even killed while on duty. The job could also be exhausting. Watchmen worked through the night, often in terrible weather. Freezing winters, pouring rain and fog didn't stop the rounds. Falling asleep on the job wasn't just frowned upon. It could get you fined, fired, or even publicly shamed. Despite the hardships, the watchman was a trusted figure. In some towns, he also doubled as a wake-up caller, knocking on certain doors to rouse workers before dawn. Others kept records of crimes or suspicious activity, becoming the earliest form of local law enforcement. By the 19th century, Night watchmen were slowly replaced by organized police forces and alarm clocks. But for centuries, they were the only thing standing between sleeping townsfolk and chaos. So next time you hear church bells or see a glowing street lamp outside your window, remember the night watchman, the man who braved thieves, storms, and pitch-black streets just to keep time and keep watch, whispering to a whole town as it slept, "All is well."
Corpse Handler. The battle is over, but the silence is worse than the noise. Flies buzz over the field. The air stinks of blood and smoke, and your job is just beginning. You are a corpse handler, and it's your duty to deal with what's left behind when the fighting stops. When armies clashed in the pre-modern world, they didn't have recovery teams or organized burial crews waiting nearby. After the dead were counted, if they were counted at all, someone had to clear the battlefield. That someone was often a low-ranking laborer, prisoner, or even local villager pressed into service as a corpse handler. The work started as soon as it was safe to go out among the bodies. Handlers had to move from corpse to corpse, checking for valuables, removing weapons, and sometimes looting clothing or armor before burial. Some were officially sanctioned to take items for the army. Others simply scavenged whatever they could before the bodies rotted completely. Then came the grimmest part, disposal. The bodies had to be buried, burned, or at least dragged into mass graves before disease could spread. Handlers dug enormous pits, working under the hot sun or in freezing mud, lifting and stacking corpses like firewood. The smell was overpowering, a mix of blood, decay, and gunpowder. Some handlers wore cloths over their faces, but nothing could keep out the stench completely. It was dangerous work. Bodies could carry diseases that infected handlers through cuts or open sores. Some corpses were booby-trapped or left with still loaded weapons, making every movement risky. And there was always the chance of stumbling upon wounded soldiers still alive, some begging for help, others too far gone to save. The psychological toll was enormous. Imagine spending day after day knee-deep in death, surrounded by silence, broken only by the crows picking at the dead. Many handlers became numb to the sight of mangled bodies just to keep working. Others drank heavily to dull their senses. Yet this job was critical. Leaving corpses on the field was not just unsanitary, it was a threat to morale. Rotting bodies could poison water sources, spread plague, and attract scavenging animals. Clearing them away was as much a military necessity as winning the battle itself. And for all that, corpse handlers rarely got thanks or recognition. They were seen as grim necessities, even feared or avoided by soldiers once their work was done. Some were paid, some were forced, but few were respected. So the next time you see a dramatic movie battle that ends with heroic music and cheering troops, remember that the real aftermath was far messier. and it was left to people like the corpse handlers, men who had to walk through the dead, strip them, bury them, and make sure the living could move on without being consumed by the rot of war. Sapper. The air is thick with dust. Your only light is a flickering torch. You're lying on your stomach, digging through the earth under enemy walls, praying they don't hear you coming, or worse, that the tunnel doesn't collapse on top of you. This was the deadly job of the sapper, the soldiers who turned digging into a weapon of war. Before explosives and artillery could bring down a fortress, armies relied on sappers to undermine enemy walls, literally. Their job was to dig tunnels toward the base of a wall, prop them up with wooden supports, then collapse the tunnel so the wall above would crumble. Sometimes they packed the tunnel with flammable material, set it on fire, and ran, hoping the burning supports would weaken the wall enough to make it fall. It was slow, back-breaking, and terrifying work. Sappers had to dig quietly to avoid alerting defenders, who often listened for the sound of picks underground. If the defenders heard them, they might dig a counter-tunnel to break into the sappers' passage and attack them underground in brutal, close-quarters combat. Even without enemies fighting back, the tunnels themselves were dangerous. The supports could give way, burying the diggers alive. Air was scarce, and fires sometimes used up the oxygen, suffocating anyone inside. The tunnels were dark, hot, and cramped. Sappers spent hours crawling on hands and knees, covered in mud and sweat, working by the light of a single lamp. Explosives made the job even riskier when they were introduced later. Sappers had to carry barrels of gunpowder into the tunnels, place them carefully, and light the fuse, all while hoping they could escape before it blew. A single mistake could detonate the entire tunnel while they were still inside. And if the enemy figured out what they were doing, they might flood the tunnels with water, smoke them out, or set their own fires to collapse the passage. Sappers were in constant danger, not just from the earth itself, but from the defenders above who were desperate to stop them. Despite the danger, sappers were essential to siege warfare. Without them, castles and fortresses could hold out for months or even years. A successful sap could end a siege overnight, letting the attacking army storm through the breach and claim victory. But the price was high. Many sappers never saw the battle they were digging for. They were crushed, burned, suffocated, or cut down in the dark. Their work was invisible to most of the army, but without it, many of history's great conquests never would have happened. So the next time you see a castle wall and marvel at how strong it looks, imagine being the soldier crawling underneath it, listening for the creak of timber above your head, knowing that if it snaps, the earth itself will become your grave. Lime sprinkler. The white dust coats your clothes, your face, your lungs. Your eyes sting and your throat burns, but you keep shoveling, spreading more of it over the pit of bodies at your feet. This was the grim work of the lime sprinkler, the men tasked with covering mass graves during wars and plague outbreaks. Quicklime, calcium oxide, was the disinfectant of choice for centuries. When mixed with moisture, it heats up and helps break down corpses faster, while also killing some of the pathogens that could spread disease. In times of war or epidemic, when bodies piled up faster than they could be buried properly, lime sprinklers were called in to control the stench and prevent outbreaks from getting even worse. The job was simple but horrifying. After a battle or plague sweep, the dead would be hauled to mass graves, huge pits dug hastily outside city walls or near battlefields. Lime sprinklers would climb to the edge with shovels and sacks of quicklime, spreading it across layer after layer of bodies before covering them with dirt. The work was dangerous in ways most people never realized. Quicklime reacts violently with moisture, even the moisture in your skin, causing chemical burns. Breathing in lime dust scorched the throat and lungs, leading to chronic coughing, ulcers, and sometimes permanent lung damage. And because sprinklers worked right above the graves, they were constantly exposed to the smell of decay and whatever diseases might still be lingering on the corpses below. There was no protective gear, no masks, no goggles, just rags tied over the mouth at best. The dust stuck to sweaty skin, got in the eyes, and mixed with the damp air around the pits. Some men fainted from the fumes or heat of the quicklime reaction. Others collapsed from the emotional toll of spending day after day standing over hundreds of bodies, some of which were barely cold. Despite the horror, lime sprinkling was considered vital. Without it, plague could spread from rotting bodies, contaminating water sources, and sickening entire towns. Soldiers and civilians alike depended on these grim workers to keep death contained, even as it surrounded them. Pay was meager, and respect was non-existent. Lime sprinklers were often outcasts, criminals pressed into labor, or the very poor who had no other way to earn money. People avoided them in the streets, afraid they carried the taint of death. But they kept doing it because someone had to. So the next time you read about a battle or epidemic from centuries past, remember that the story didn't end when the fighting stopped or the fever broke. Someone still had to climb to the edge of those pits, shovel lime into the choking air, and stand there until every last body was covered. The war had its heroes, but the lime sprinklers made sure its aftermath didn't kill even more.
Messenger boy. Bullets snap past your ears. Mud splashes as you sprint, heart hammering, clutching a folded paper that could change the outcome of the battle. There's no cover, no time to think, just run. You are a messenger boy in World War I, and your job is to deliver orders while the world explodes around you. Before radios were reliable, armies depended on runners, usually very young men, to carry critical messages between command posts, trenches, and artillery positions. These weren't casual errands. The orders they carried decided when troops would attack, where artillery would fire, and whether reinforcements would arrive in time. A delay could mean disaster. Messenger boys had to leave the relative safety of the trench and dash across open ground, often through no man's land while under enemy fire. They were easy targets for snipers, machine guns, and artillery. Some ran through gas clouds, choking and tearing up as they tried to keep moving. If the terrain was too dangerous to cross upright, they crawled, belly down, in the mud, with shells exploding around them. There were no second chances. If you were hit and the message didn't get through, entire units could be wiped out, waiting for orders that never came. That meant messenger boys often had to take enormous risks, zigzagging through shell holes, jumping over barbed wire, and even running at night with nothing but flares and muzzle flashes to guide them. The job demanded speed, endurance, and nerves of steel. Messenger boys couldn't panic, even when friends fell beside them. Some had to carry multiple messages in one run, each one meant for a different officer. And once they delivered them, they had to turn right back around and run through the same gauntlet to bring back replies. The psychological strain was intense. Every trip could be your last, and there was no way to predict where the next shell would land. Some boys developed trench foot from being constantly soaked in waterlogged boots. Others suffered shell shock from the constant blasts. Many never made it home. Yet despite the danger, messenger boys were crucial to keeping the front lines functioning. Radios could be jammed, telegraph wires could be cut, and signal flags didn't work in fog or darkness, but a runner could always get through, as long as he was fast and lucky enough to survive. Some messenger boys were decorated for bravery, earning medals for delivering orders under fire that saved entire battalions. But most were simply anonymous heroes, their names lost to history. So the next time you think of World War I trench warfare, picture the lone figure sprinting across the mud, clutching a single piece of paper, knowing that if he slowed down for even a second, the message, and maybe the men depending on it, would never make it through.
Ship bilge cleaner. The air is damp and foul, the space barely big enough to crouch in, and the smell makes you gag instantly. You can hear the creak of the ship above, but down here you're on your own, knee-deep in sludge. This was the miserable life of the ship bilge cleaner, the person tasked with keeping a ship's dirtiest, most forgotten space from turning into a floating cesspool. The bilge is the lowest part of a ship, where all the water, oil, and filth that leak through the decks eventually collect. It's dark, cramped, and full of stagnant water. Left alone, it turns into a breeding ground for disease, with a stench so powerful sailors claimed you could smell a dirty bilge before the ship even docked. Cleaning it was brutal work. Bilge cleaners had to climb into the lowest parts of the hull, usually armed with buckets, scrapers, and rags. They scooped out sludge by hand, sometimes lying on their stomachs to reach narrow corners. The mixture they worked in was a disgusting cocktail of seawater, rotten food, animal waste if livestock were on board, and dead rats, all fermenting together in the heat. The air was stifling. Ventilation was almost non-existent, and the lack of oxygen made breathing difficult. Some cleaners fainted from the fumes and had to be dragged out before they suffocated. Others picked up infections from cuts on their hands or feet, since bilge water was full of bacteria and parasites. Diseases like dysentery, cholera, and typhus spread easily among crews,
and the bilge was often the source. This job wasn't just disgusting, it was dangerous. Ships were full of flammable materials, and bilge water sometimes contained spilled alcohol, oil, or gunpowder residue. One spark could ignite the fumes and turn the lowest deck into a death trap. And on warships, cleaners had to work fast between battles, clearing the bilge so the ship wouldn't reek or become dangerously waterlogged. Bilge cleaning was usually assigned to the lowest-ranking sailors or even punished crew members. It was a job no one wanted, but one that had to be done. A filthy bilge could rot the timbers of the ship and weaken the hull, making it unsafe for long voyages. Despite how essential it was, there was little gratitude for the men who did it. They emerged from the bilge reeking so badly that other sailors sometimes refused to sit near them. The stench clung to their clothes and skin no matter how hard they scrubbed. So the next time you think of the romantic age of sail, wind in the rigging, heroic captains, and grand adventures, remember the man crouched in the dark belly of the ship, scraping muck from the bilge, breathing foul air, and keeping the whole vessel from turning into a floating plague ship.
Elephant Mahout. The ground shakes beneath you as your elephant charges forward. The enemy raises their bows, and you know they're aiming at you first. If your elephant panics, you're just as likely to die under its feet as under enemy fire. This was the deadly life of the Mahout, the rider and keeper of war elephants. For centuries, war elephants were the tanks of the ancient world. Towering above the battlefield, they could smash through enemy lines, terrify cavalry, and trample soldiers like grass. But an elephant wasn't just a weapon. It needed a skilled handler. That handler was the Mahout, who sat right on the neck of the animal, guiding it with his voice, feet, and a sharp goad called an ankusha. Being a Mahout was one of the most dangerous jobs in any army. You weren't just steering a massive animal, you were sitting in the most exposed position on the battlefield. Archers, spearmen, and slingers all aimed for the Mahout first, because if you killed or wounded him, the elephant might panic, turn around, and wreak havoc on its own side. And that panic was deadly. A frightened elephant could crush its rider or go berserk, trampling soldiers from both armies. To prevent that, Mahouts were often given a small hammer and chisel, tools of last resort, so they could kill their own elephant instantly with a single blow to the skull if it became uncontrollable. Imagine the mental strain of knowing you might have to put down the very creature you'd trained and cared for in the middle of battle. Training elephants wasn't exactly safe either. Mahouts lived with their animals day and night, feeding them, bathing them, and keeping them calm. A single mistake could get you gored or crushed. And these animals weren't docile. A war elephant had to be aggressive enough to charge into a wall of spears, which meant its handler had to constantly walk a fine line between control and chaos. Life off the battlefield wasn't much easier. Mahouts were often low-status workers, expected to obey their commanders completely and take all the risk. If an elephant under their care misbehaved, the Mahout could be punished, even executed, for losing control. And yet the job carried a strange kind of pride. Elephants were some of the most valued assets in an army. And Mahouts who survived battle were trusted and respected within their units.
In some cultures, mahouts passed their elephants down through generations, forming lifelong bonds that were both practical and deeply personal. But the danger never went away. Every battle was a gamble. You could die from an enemy arrow, be crushed under your own mount, or end up having to strike the killing blow to the animal you'd spent years training. So the next time you picture an ancient battlefield filled with trumpeting war elephants, think about the man on top, exposed, sweating, and knowing that anything went wrong, he'd be the first to die.
Professional poison taster. The silver platter is set in front of you. The court is silent, watching. You lift the first bite to your lips and swallow, and then you wait. If you live, the king eats. If you die, the king survives. Welcome to the job of the professional poison taster, where every meal could be your last. For as long as there have been rulers, there have been assassins, and poison has always been one of the most feared weapons. In royal courts, from ancient Rome to Renaissance Europe, kings, queens, and emperors were terrified of being murdered through their food or drink. The solution? Hire someone expendable to taste everything first. The poison taster's job was simple but terrifying. Sample each dish and drink served to the ruler, then wait long enough to see if they showed any symptoms of poisoning. Only when the taster stayed standing could the ruler eat with confidence. But this was far from foolproof. Some poisons acted slowly, taking hours or even days to show effects. That meant a taster could survive the initial meal, only to collapse later, sometimes after the ruler had already eaten. And tasters weren't given antidotes or special training beyond eat first. They were human shields with good stomachs. The job came with enormous risk and constant fear. Every unusual flavor, every strange smell, every stomach cramp could mean the end. Some tasters tried to build resistance by taking tiny doses of common poisons over time, a practice called Mithridatism. But it wasn't a guarantee. A strong enough dose of arsenic, hemlock, or belladonna could still kill them within minutes. Despite the danger, poison tasters could hold surprisingly high status. Some were close confidants of rulers, trusted to guard their very lives. Others were slaves, servants, or soldiers, ordered into the role whether they wanted it or not. In some courts, the taster ate every single meal with the ruler, effectively becoming part of their daily routine. There were also political risks. If the ruler died after a meal, the taster was often suspected of being involved, whether or not they were guilty. Some tasters were executed simply because they didn't die fast enough to convince everyone they were innocent. But for those who survived, the job could mean steady pay, prestige, and proximity to power. Some tasters used their closeness to the ruler to gain influence or favor, walking a thin line between being a servant and a trusted insider. Still, no amount of favor could make up for the ever-present knowledge that any meal could be the last. So the next time you sit down to eat, without a second thought, remember the poison taster, the person who had to take the first bite, knowing it might be their final act, just to keep someone else alive.
Computer. Your desk is stacked high with paper. Your pencil is worn down to a nub, and your brain feels like it's melting. You've been doing nothing but calculations for hours, and you're only halfway through the day. Welcome to the life of a human computer, the people who crunched numbers by hand long before machines took over. Before electronic computers existed, computer wasn't a machine, it was a job title. Human computers were hired to perform complex math for everything from astronomy to navigation to artillery tables. If you needed to chart the orbit of a planet, predict tides, calculate shipping routes, or figure out the trajectory of a cannonball, you needed a small army of people with sharp pencils and endless patience. The work was relentless. Computers sat at long tables, sometimes in noisy rooms full of other number crunchers, copying figures, performing multiplications, and double-checking each other's results. There were no calculators, just slide rules, log tables, and pure brain power. One mistake could throw off an entire project, so accuracy was everything. It wasn't glamorous either. Human computers spent their days hunched over paper, straining their eyes and wearing grooves into their fingers. The work was repetitive to the point of mind-numbing, yet mentally exhausting, a strange combination that left many drained by the end of the day. And the deadlines could be brutal. During wartime, computers worked around the clock, producing firing tables for artillery or plotting flight paths for bombers. A single error could mean missed targets or lost lives, so the pressure was enormous. Computers often worked 6 days a week, sometimes 12 hours a day, for modest pay. The job also came with social challenges. Many computers were women, especially in the late 19th and early 20th century, when governments and observatories realized that educated women could do the work cheaply. These women often had advanced math training, but were paid a fraction of what male scientists earned, even when their calculations were just as critical. Despite the grind, some human computers made history. The women at Harvard College Observatory, known as the Harvard Computers, cataloged thousands of stars and helped lay the groundwork for modern astrophysics. During World War II, the computers at Los Alamos performed the calculations that made the Manhattan Project possible. Still, the job could feel endless. Imagine spending an entire day just calculating logarithms, only to come back tomorrow and do it again. Many burned out, went cross-eyed from staring at columns of numbers, or suffered long-term hand and wrist problems from constant writing. When electronic computers finally appeared in the mid-20th century, the human computers were gradually replaced. Some transitioned into programming, but many simply saw their jobs vanish. So the next time your calculator app does a complex equation in a fraction of a second, remember the people who once spent days doing the same math by hand, one line at a time, with no guarantee they'd get it right the first time.
Circus geek. The crowd leans in, half horrified, half thrilled. You step into the spotlight, grab a live chicken, and do the unthinkable.
biting off its head as the audience gasps. This was the grim, bloody reality of the circus geek, one of the most shocking sideshow performers in history. In the early 20th century, traveling carnivals and sideshows were desperate to shock and entertain crowds. They had sword swallowers, fire eaters, and strongmen. But for those who wanted something more extreme, there was the geek act. The geek was usually the lowest status performer, brought out last as a kind of freakish grand finale. The act was simple but gruesome. The geek would bite the heads off live animals, usually chickens, sometimes snakes or rats, in front of a cheering, jeering audience. The point wasn't skill or talent. It was pure shock value. Audiences came for the grotesque thrill of watching someone do something they could barely stomach to witness. Behind the scenes, the life of a geek was miserable. Many were desperate drifters or alcoholics who took the job because no one else would hire them. Showmen would often lure them in with promises of shelter, food, and booze, then keep them dependent to ensure they stayed with the show. Some were paid partly in alcohol, just to dull the horror of what they had to do. The work was degrading and dangerous. Handling live animals that fought back meant scratches, bites, and infections were common. Sanitation was non-existent, so geeks risked catching diseases from the animals they killed. And the psychological toll was crushing. Spending night after night, killing animals for applause, pushed many into deeper addiction or despair. Yet the geek act was popular. It became a notorious symbol of the seedy underbelly of carnival life, something both audiences and performers knew was crossing a line but couldn't look away from. It was the ultimate exploitation of both man and animal, packaged as entertainment. Some geeks leaned into the performance, creating entire personas around their act, but most were simply trapped by poverty, addiction, or coercion. Many never escaped carnival life, traveling from town to town until they physically couldn't perform anymore. Eventually, public opinion turned against such acts. Animal cruelty laws and changing tastes made geek shows less acceptable, and by the mid-20th century they were rare. Today, the word geek has a completely different meaning, referring to passionate fans of technology or pop culture, but its origins are rooted in the blood and dirt of carnival sideshows. So the next time you hear someone proudly call themselves a geek, remember that once upon a time, being a geek meant standing under hot lights, holding a terrified animal, and doing something so shocking that audiences screamed, and you got paid just enough to do it again tomorrow.
Bearded Lady. The curtain lifts, the crowd gasps, and all eyes are on you. Some people stare in awe, others in disgust, but you keep smiling, because this is how you make a living. This was the life of the Bearded Lady, one of the most famous but most exploited sideshow performers in circus history. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, freak shows were a major part of traveling circuses and carnivals. People flocked to see anything unusual. Giants, dwarfs, conjoined twins, and yes, women with full beards. These performers were billed as curiosities, sometimes given exotic or fake backstories to make them seem even stranger. Bearded ladies often had a real medical condition, like hirsutism or polycystic ovary syndrome, which caused excessive hair growth. In a society that judged women harshly for looking different, many of them faced ridicule or rejection in their daily lives. The circus offered them a way to turn that difference into income, but it came at a price. Performing in a sideshow meant living life on display. Every day, the bearded lady had to stand in front of curious crowds while people whispered, pointed, and sometimes laughed. Promoters often exaggerated her story, calling her a half-man, half-woman, or spinning myths about her being from some mysterious foreign tribe. It was part theater, part exploitation. Pay was usually low, especially compared to how much money the circus owners made from ticket sales. Many performers were under contract that kept them traveling constantly with little control over their schedule or image. Some were forced to pose for photographs and promotional posters without extra pay, becoming famous without ever sharing in the profits. And yet, for some, this job was empowering. The circus gave them a community of other performers who understood what it meant to be different. Some bearded ladies became genuine celebrities, dressing in elegant gowns, speaking confidently to audiences, and building careers that lasted for decades. Still, the work took a toll. Constant public scrutiny could be exhausting. Some performers faced harassment both from outsiders and from their own employers. And when sideshows began to decline in the mid-20th century, many of these women were left without income or support. Today, we tend to look back on sideshows with a mix of fascination and discomfort. They gave marginalized people a way to survive, but they also put them on display in ways that sometimes dehumanized them. So, the next time you see an old circus poster advertising a bearded lady, remember that behind the spectacle was a real woman making the best of a world that didn't accept her. She wasn't just an oddity, she was a professional, an entertainer, and someone who turned her difference into a career, even when the world tried to turn her into a joke.
Fire eater. The crowd holds its breath. You tip the torch toward your mouth, flames licking dangerously close to your face. Or tilt your head back and slide a gleaming steel blade down your throat. One slip, one mistake, and you're dead. This was the life of the fire eaters and sword swallowers who risked everything for applause. These performers were the daredevils of the circus and carnival world, specializing in acts that seemed to defy the limits of the human body. Fire eaters would snuff out torches with their mouths, spew flames by spitting fuel, or hold burning sticks between their teeth. Sword swallowers took solid steel blades, sometimes multiple swords at once, and slid them down their esophagus until the hilt rested against their lips. The danger wasn't just part of the act, it was constant. Fire eaters risked burns to their lips, tongue, and throat every time they performed. A single wrong breath could pull flames into the lungs, causing fatal internal burns. Many suffered blistered mouths, scorched hair, and permanent throat damage. The fuel used for fire breathing could also poison them if swallowed. Sword swallowing was no less deadly. performers had to learn to suppress the gag reflex and align their throat and stomach just right so the sword could pass through without puncturing anything. One wrong angle could pierce the esophagus, nick an artery, or perforate the stomach, all of which could lead to infection or death. And yes, accidents happened. Some performers died on stage. And then there were infections. Before antibiotics, even a small burn or cut could turn into something life-threatening. Performers sometimes worked with untreated injuries, knowing they couldn't afford to miss shows. Their pain was hidden behind a smile and a dramatic bow as the crowd roared with applause. These acts weren't just dangerous, they were physically grueling. Fire eaters had to train their mouths to withstand intense heat, often developing scar tissue over time. Sword swallowers trained for months, sometimes years, to master their technique. It wasn't magic or illusion. It was muscle control, discipline, and sheer nerve. Despite the risk, the pay wasn't always great. Many fire eaters and sword swallowers worked as part of traveling shows, splitting earnings with the rest of the troupe. Some were exploited by show owners who cared more about ticket sales than the performer's safety. Yet there was a strange pride in this work. These performers became legends of the Midway, celebrated for doing what others wouldn't dare. The most famous sword swallowers could swallow curved blades, bayonets, or even glowing neon tubes, pushing the boundaries of what seemed humanly possible. So, the next time you see someone swallow a sword on TV or blow fire into the night sky, remember that it isn't just a trick. It's a dangerous tradition built on centuries of risk, injury, and sometimes death, all for the sake of a moment that made the crowd gasp.
Professional mourner. Your throat is raw, your voice nearly gone, but you can't stop crying. The drums are beating, the family is watching, and your tears aren't even yours. You are a professional mourner, paid to wail for hours at someone else's funeral. In ancient China, Egypt, and many other cultures, mourning wasn't just a private expression of grief. It was a public duty. A proper funeral required loud, visible sorrow, sometimes for days at a time. Families who could afford it hired professional mourners, usually women, to make sure the dead received a dramatic send-off. The job was grueling. Professional mourners had to cry loudly, wail, tear at their hair, beat their chests, and sometimes throw themselves on the ground as if overcome with grief. This wasn't just for show. It was believed that the louder the mourning, the more respect was being shown to the deceased. In some traditions, it was even thought that mourners could help guide the dead safely into the afterlife. But it was hard, exhausting work. Imagine screaming and sobbing for hours under a burning sun or in a crowded tomb, your face streaked with tears and sweat. Your voice would grow hoarse, your chest would ache, and yet you had to keep going until the ritual was complete. Some mourners worked multiple funerals a week, crying for strangers so often that they barely had time to recover before the next ceremony. In ancient Egypt, professional mourners sometimes played specific roles, even dressing as goddesses like Isis and Nephthys.
the divine sisters who mourned Osiris. They would stand beside the coffin, wailing in unison, creating a sound meant to echo through the halls of the dead. In ancient China, mourners might wear sackcloth, roll in ashes, and cry until their faces were swollen and red, all as proof of proper filial piety. Despite the intense performance, mourners were not always respected. Some people mocked them for being insincere, for selling their tears. Others saw them as a necessary part of the ritual, but nothing more. Tools for appearances, rather than people with feelings. And yet their work carried weight. A funeral without mourners might be seen as shameful, suggesting the deceased had no one to grieve them. Professional mourners gave even the poorest or most disliked person a final moment of dignity. Over time, the practice faded in some places, but in others it continued for centuries. Even today, professional mourners still exist in parts of the world, keeping the tradition alive. So the next time you imagine an ancient funeral, incense burning, drums beating, crowds gathered, picture the mourners, their voices breaking, their bodies shaking, weeping not for family, but because that was their job. They weren't just crying, they were working, turning grief into a performance for the living and the dead.
Mudlark. The tide is low, the river stinks, and your feet sink ankle-deep into black, sticky mud. You wade forward anyway, hoping to find something valuable before the water comes back in, or before you step on something worse. This was the life of the mudlark, one of Victorian London's dirtiest and most desperate jobs. Mudlarks were scavengers who worked along the banks of the River Thames, searching for anything they could sell. Bits of coal, scrap metal, ropes, bottles, even bones. At low tide, the river would leave behind a thick layer of sludge mixed with centuries of garbage, sewage, and dead animals. Sometimes there were human bodies too, victims of drownings, disease, or crime. Mudlarking was mostly done by the poor, especially children. It required no tools beyond a stick and strong stomach, and it was one of the few ways desperate families could make money. But it was filthy, dangerous work. The mud was full of sharp objects, broken glass, and rusted nails. One bad cut could lead to infection, which was often fatal in an era before antibiotics. The smell was overwhelming. The Thames during the 1800s was basically an open sewer, carrying human waste, factory runoff, and dead animals straight through the heart of the city. The air was so foul that visitors wrote about gagging when they came near the river. Mudlarks worked in this environment for hours, knee-deep in filth, breathing in toxic fumes and risking diseases like cholera and typhoid. And the tide was always a threat. The Thames could rise quickly, trapping mudlarks far from shore. More than a few drowned while trying to haul their finds back to safety. Others were swept away by passing boats, crushed against piers, or caught in whirlpools. Despite the risks, mudlarking was competitive. Many scavengers worked the same stretch of river, racing each other to grab anything of value. If you were too slow, you went home empty-handed.
The haul was rarely worth much. A day's work might only earn a few pennies. But for the poorest Londoners, that could mean the difference between eating and starving. Some woodlarks became notorious figures, known by name to locals. Others were ignored entirely, part of the background noise of London slums. Charles Dickens even wrote about them, using mudlarks as symbols of poverty and desperation in his stories. Today, the Thames is much cleaner, but mudlarking still exists, though now it's a hobby, regulated by permits, and people search for historical artifacts rather than scrap to sell. So the next time you see a calm, picturesque photo of London's river, imagine it as it once was, a reeking black tide where children dug through the muck with bare hands, hoping to find a lump of coal, a rusty nail, anything worth a few pennies before the river rose and swallowed them whole.
Treadmill prisoner. Step, step, step. The wheel creaks, your legs ache, and there's no end in sight. You're not walking to go anywhere. You're walking to suffer. This was the punishment of the treadmill prisoner, condemned to spend hours every day climbing a never-ending wheel just to grind grain. In the early 19th century, prisons in Britain introduced treadmills as a way to discipline inmates and extract labor from them at the same time. Imagine a giant hamster wheel laid on its side, with steps built into it like a staircase. Prisoners would stand side by side on the wheel and climb, forcing it to rotate. The motion powered machinery like grain mills or pumps, turning prisoners into literal engines of industry. The punishment was deliberately designed to be exhausting. Prisoners worked in shifts, sometimes climbing the wheel for 6 to 8 hours a day, broken into 15 or 20-minute stretches. Over the course of a single day, a man might climb the equivalent of thousands of feet, as much as ascending a mountain, with no purpose other than to be punished. The physical toll was immense. Prisoners' legs swelled, their feet blistered, and their backs ached from the constant strain. If someone stumbled, they risked being trampled by the person behind them. Guards stood by with whips to make sure no one slowed down or stopped. And the punishment wasn't just physical, it was psychological. There was no sense of accomplishment, no progress to measure, just endless repetition. The treadmill was nicknamed the everlasting staircase because it went nowhere, and that was the point. It was designed to break the spirit as much as the body. Conditions could be brutal. Many treadmills were outdoors, so prisoners worked in freezing rain, scorching sun, or biting wind. There was little rest between shifts, and food was minimal. Some prisoners fainted from exhaustion and were revived just to be put back on the wheel. Despite its cruelty, prison officials considered the treadmill a moral improvement over earlier punishments like whipping or execution. They believed that hard, monotonous labor would reform criminals by teaching discipline. In reality, it often left them crippled, exhausted, and more bitter than before. Eventually, treadmills were criticized as inhumane, and by the late 19th century, they were phased out in most places. But for decades, they were a symbol of the Victorian idea of productive punishment, work that hurt. Ironically, the concept survives today in a very different form. Modern exercise treadmills take their name from these devices, though now people voluntarily run on them for health instead of punishment.
So the next time you're on a treadmill at the gym, sweating and wishing you were done, remember the prisoners who climbed for hours every day under the threat of the whip, not to get fit, but simply to pay for their crimes, one endless step at a time.
The sun has just dipped below the horizon, and the streets are darkening fast. You shoulder your ladder, strike a flame, and climb to the first post. One wrong step, and you could break your neck, but the whole town is waiting for you to bring the night to life. This was the job of the lamplighter, the person who kept the streets glowing before electricity existed. Before the invention of electric streetlights, cities were lit with gas lamps, hundreds or even thousands of them lining the streets. But those lamps didn't turn on by themselves. Every evening, just after sunset, lamplighters would make their rounds. Carrying a long pole with a flame or wick at the end, they would climb ladders or use the pole's hook to open the gas valve, light the lamp, and move to the next one. It was repetitive work, but surprisingly dangerous. Ladders were tall, streets were uneven, and lighting a lamp meant balancing at just the right height while handling an open flame. A slip could mean a broken leg, or worse. In some cities, lamplighters had to work in all weather. Rain, snow, and icy winds made climbing even riskier. The job didn't end when the lamps were lit. Lamplighters also had to keep the lamps clean and filled with fuel, trimming the wicks and making sure the glass globes weren't covered in soot. A dirty lamp wouldn't shine brightly. So every morning, lamplighters went back through their routes to put the lights out and check for damage. And then there were the less obvious dangers. Gas leaks could cause explosions, and the open flames could ignite clothing if the lamplighter wasn't careful. In rough neighborhoods, lamplighters also risked being mugged while out on their lonely rounds. Despite the hazards, the job carried a certain dignity. Lamplighters were often well known in their communities, greeted by neighbors as they passed. Their work literally brought light to the city, turning dark, unsafe streets into safer, walkable spaces. In some towns, they were even responsible for sounding the alarm if they spotted fires or trouble while on their routes. The arrival of electric streetlights in the late 19th and early 20th centuries slowly made the job obsolete. Some lamplighters transitioned into maintaining the new electric lights, but many simply lost their livelihoods as entire cities flipped a switch and made their work unnecessary. Today, lamplighting is mostly ceremonial, preserved in a few historic districts where the tradition is kept alive for tourists. So the next time you see a glowing streetlight, think of the lamplighter, a solitary figure moving from post to post as the sky darkened, striking flames against the night one lamp at a time, risking falls and burns so the rest of the city could walk home in safety.
Workhouse orphan. You're 8 years old, and your day starts before sunrise with the sound of a bell. There's no playtime, no schoolyard, just endless labor until nightfall. You are a workhouse orphan, and every day is a fight to survive in a place that was supposed to take care of you. In Victorian England, workhouses were meant to provide food and shelter for the poor, but for orphans, they were more like prisons. Once inside, children were put to work immediately. They swept floors, washed laundry, scrubbed walls, picked oakum, pulling apart old ropes with their bare fingers, or were sent out to work in factories and fields. The work was grueling and lasted up to 12 or even 14 hours a day. The tasks were deliberately monotonous and physically exhausting, designed to discourage people from relying on charity. Oakum picking alone could shred a child's fingers until they bled, and there were no gloves to protect them. Living conditions were harsh. Orphans were housed in dormitories with rows of hard beds, little privacy, and poor sanitation. Meals were meager, often just thin porridge, bread or gruel, and hunger was a constant companion. Punishments were severe. Talking during meals, working too slowly, or misbehaving could mean being locked in a dark cell, caned, or even deprived of food. Many workhouse orphans never received a proper education. They grew up illiterate, with no prospects beyond more hard labor once they reached adulthood. Some were apprenticed out to employers, which often meant being used as cheap, expendable labor in dangerous jobs like chimney sweeping or farm work. Disease was rampant in overcrowded workhouses. Outbreaks of measles, scarlet fever, and tuberculosis could wipe out dozens of children at a time. Medical care was basic at best, sometimes just a quick inspection and a dose of whatever medicine the workhouse could afford. The psychological toll was enormous. Orphans in workhouses grew up without family, affection, or security. They were often treated as burdens rather than children, disciplined harshly to make them obedient and useful. Many carried the trauma of those years for the rest of their lives. And yet, workhouses were considered a form of charity. Reformers claimed they were teaching children discipline and saving them from starvation in the streets. In reality, they often broke their bodies and spirits before they had a chance to grow up. Charles Dickens famously exposed the cruelty of workhouse life in books like Oliver Twist, which shocked Victorian readers and sparked some reforms. But for countless orphans, those changes came too late. So the next time you picture childhood as a time of freedom and play, think of the workhouse orphans, children who spent their days hunched over dirty ropes, hands bleeding, stomachs empty, dreaming not of toys, but of a day when they might finally be free. Bone Picker. The field is silent, except for the crunch under your boots. You crouch down, pick up a half-rotted bone, and toss it into your sack. The smell is awful, but you can't stop because this is your job. You are a bone picker, scavenging the dead to keep the living fed. In Victorian England, bones were a valuable commodity. They were ground down to make fertilizer for farms, used to make glue, and even turned into bone china for the wealthy. But those bones had to come from somewhere, and that's where bone pickers came in. Bone pickers scoured the streets, fields, and slaughterhouses, looking for anything they could collect. The remains of dead animals, discarded carcasses, and sometimes even human bones from neglected graves or battlefields. They carried large sacks or baskets, filling them piece by piece until they had enough to sell to a rag and bone man or directly to a bone mill. The work was dirty, smelly, and dangerous. Bones were often rotting, crawling with maggots, and still covered in bits of flesh. Handling them meant constant exposure to disease. Cuts on the hands could easily get infected, and there was no running water or soap to clean up afterward. And then there was the smell. Bone pickers were known for reeking of decay. People avoided them in public, sometimes crossing the street to get away from the stench. It was a job that kept you fed, but also kept you isolated. Respectable society wanted your work, but not your company. Despite the disgust, bones were in high demand. Agriculture relied on bone meal as fertilizer to restore nutrients to depleted soil. Before chemical fertilizers were invented, ground-up bones were one of the best ways to boost crop yields. That meant bone pickers were a crucial link in the food chain, even if no one wanted to admit it. Pay was low, just enough to survive, so bone pickers worked long hours to fill their sacks. They traveled miles every day, often competing with dogs, rats, and other scavengers for the best finds. Bad weather didn't stop them. If they didn't pick bones, they didn't eat. Some bone pickers were children, sent out to help support their families. Others were widows or the unemployed, people with no other options. It was one of the lowest rungs on the Victorian social ladder, a job that kept you alive, but never let you climb out of poverty. Still, the work mattered. Without bone pickers, the fields wouldn't have been fertilized, the factories wouldn't have had material for glue, and even the fine bone china prized by the upper class wouldn't have existed. So the next time you see a pristine porcelain teacup in a museum, remember that its origin might have been a filthy field, a dead animal, and a bone picker trudging home at dusk with a sack of death slung over their shoulder.
Pure Finder. You're walking through the streets of Victorian London with a bucket in one hand and a shovel in the other, and you're looking for one thing: fresh dog poop. You are a pure finder, one of the strangest and smelliest professions of the 19th century. Pure was the polite term for dog feces, and believe it or not, it was big business. Tanneries, where animal hides were turned into leather, needed it as part of the process. The enzymes in dog dung softened hides and helped strip away hair, making the leather more flexible. So tanneries paid people to bring it in by the bucketful. Pure finders spent their days walking the streets, alleys, and parks, collecting drop-ins wherever they could find them. They carried buckets or sacks, scraping up fresh piles with sticks or shovels, then hauling them to the tannery for cash. It was one of the filthiest jobs in the city, but for the very poor, it was a way to earn a few pennies a day. The smell was overwhelming. Pure finders reeked of their work, and the odor followed them everywhere. People avoided them on the street, and shopkeepers sometimes refused to serve them because of the stench. But there was no way to stay clean. The buckets sloshed, the smell clung to clothes, and sometimes the pure spilled during transport. the job was also hazardous. London's streets were full of disease, and handling animal waste with bare hands meant constant exposure to parasites and infections. Cuts and sores could become infected, and there were no antibiotics to save someone from blood poisoning. Despite the disgusting nature of the work, tanneries depended on purifinders to keep them supplied. The demand was so high that some collectors became territorial about their routes, fighting with rivals over the best spots for gathering droppings. And it wasn't just dog waste they used. Some purifinders collected human waste too, selling it to other industries that needed ammonia-rich material for cleaning wool or dyeing cloth. The poorest Londoners became experts at monetizing filth, turning the city's waste into a strange kind of currency. Pure finding was one of the lowest status jobs you could have, and it was often a last resort for widows, the elderly, or the sick who couldn't do heavier labor. Still, it was better than starving, and in some neighborhoods, pure finders were a common sight, shuffling down the street with their buckets of stank. Eventually, chemical alternatives replaced dog dung in tanneries, and the job disappeared. But for decades, it was a vital, if revolting, part of London's economy.
Crossing sweeper. The clatter of carriage wheels is getting closer. You grab your broom and rush to clear the road, sweeping horse manure aside so the wealthy lady in silks doesn't soil her shoes. This was the job of the crossing sweeper, one of the most humiliating but oddly necessary roles of Victorian street life. In 19th century cities, roads were filthy. Horse-drawn carriages were everywhere, and horses produced tons of manure every day, literally. Streets were covered in mud, dung, and whatever else the city threw at them. For pedestrians, crossing the road without stepping in something disgusting was nearly impossible. That's where crossing sweepers came in. Armed with a broom or brush, they staked out busy intersections and cleared a path through the mess whenever someone wanted to cross. They weren't city employees. They worked for tips, relying on the generosity or guilt of wealthy passers-by. The work was constant. Streets filled with muck quickly, and sweepers had to stay alert, ready to rush forward the moment a carriage passed. They often stood for hours in the rain, wind, or scorching sun, just waiting for customers. If they missed a spot and someone's shoes or dress got dirty, they might get yelled at, or worse, refused payment. It wasn't just manure they had to deal with. Streets were full of dead animals, rotting food, and industrial waste. Crossing sweepers worked in the middle of it all, breathing the stench, risking disease, and dodging carts that could easily run them over if they didn't move fast enough. Most sweepers were extremely poor. Children, beggars, the elderly, or disabled people who had few other ways to earn a living. Some were homeless and slept on the streets they worked on. Their tips were meager, often just a penny or two per crossing. The job carried a weird social tension. Sweepers were both useful and invisible, appreciated when needed, but ignored the rest of the time. Some wealthy pedestrians even saw them as a nuisance, accusing them of making the street dirtier just so they could earn more money clearing it again. Still, a good crossing sweeper could develop a regular clientele. They might reserve the cleanest crossing in a wealthy neighborhood, becoming a familiar sight to the local elite. Some even dressed neatly and tried to act polite and cheerful to earn bigger tips. By the late 19th century, the rise of modern sanitation and street cleaning crews, along with the decline of horse-drawn traffic, made the job obsolete. But for decades, crossing sweepers were a common part of urban life, standing in the filth to make sure the upper class could walk in comfort. So the next time you step onto a clean crosswalk, think of the crossing sweepers, standing ankle-deep in muck, broom in hand, hoping for a coin while the carriages rolled past and the city stank around them.
Child pearl diver. You take a deep breath, leap into the water, and plunge into the blue silence below. The ocean presses in on all sides. Your lungs are already burning, and you have to keep diving, because your family's survival depends on what you find at the bottom. This was the perilous life of the child pearl diver, one of the most dangerous jobs for kids in history. For centuries, coastal communities in Japan, India, and the Persian Gulf relied on pearl diving as a source of income. Natural pearls were incredibly valuable, and finding them meant diving to the ocean floor to pry open oysters by hand. Children were often sent to do this work because they were small, agile, and fast swimmers. The job was as simple as it was deadly. Divers would strip down, sometimes with only a nose clip and a basket, then plunge into the water and swim as deep as they could, often 30 or 40 feet, to reach the oyster beds. They had to work quickly, holding their breath the entire time, prying loose as many oysters as possible before swimming back up. Drowning was a constant risk. If a diver got tangled in seaweed, panicked, or stayed down too long, there was no rescue. They simply never came back up. And if that wasn't enough, the ocean itself was full of hazards. Sharks, jellyfish, stingrays, and other predators lurked in the same waters where the children worked. Even when they made it back to the surface, the work wasn't over. Divers repeated this process dozens of times a day, their ears aching from pressure changes, their lungs screaming for air. Long-term divers often developed ruptured eardrums, chronic sinus problems, or blackouts from pushing their bodies too far. The pay was meager compared to the risk. Children and their families earned only a small fraction of what the pearls were worth on the market. Many worked under brutal conditions for pearl merchants who took most of the profit. Yet pearl diving was often seen as an honorable tradition. In Japan, the famous ama divers, some of them girls as young as 10, trained from childhood, passing the skill from generation to generation.
In India and the Gulf, entire coastal villages depended on pearl diving seasons to survive. The job declined sharply in the 20th century when cultured pearls became common and safer methods were developed. But for centuries, children were among the ones who risked their lives every day just to bring up a handful of oysters, hoping that one might contain a pearl worth enough to make the danger worthwhile. So the next time you see a perfect pearl glinting in a piece of jewelry, remember the child who once had to dive into dark, predator-filled waters, lungs straining, heart pounding, betting their life on a treasure hidden deep beneath the waves.